The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It pattered against the windows of the King County Sheriff's Office, streaking the glass in rivulets that caught the amber glow of streetlights below. Inside, Detective Dave Reichert sat at his desk, staring at a photograph that had been pulled from the cold waters of the Green River earlier that afternoon. A young woman, 19 years old, her eyes closed, her skin pale as parchment. She was the 5th body found in as many weeks, all discovered near the same stretch of muddy riverbank just south of Seattle. The summer of 1982 had turned the Pacific Northwest into a hunting ground, though no one yet knew the scope of what was unfolding. The women were vanishing from the streets of Sea-Tac Strip, from the motels and truck stops where they worked the night hours. They disappeared without screams, without witnesses, without trace, and then they reappeared, floating in the river or hidden in the dense underbrush of the forested hillsides. By August, the count had risen. By September, panic had begun to settle over the city like the low fog that clung to Puget Sound. Somewhere in the shadows of Seattle, a man moved through the rain-slicked streets hunting, and he would not stop for nearly 2 decades.
Tonight, Seattle is on edge after another body was found near the Green River.
Phones haven't stopped. We're drowning in tips.
He's still out there.
Police urge residents to stay inside at night and travel in pairs.
Chapter 1. The Strip. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world outside has grown small and still. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whatever hour finds you in this moment, let it fade gently away. The present can wait. History calls softly from the shadows, patient and persistent as rain against stone. Tonight we travel not to ancient courts or distant battlefields, but to a time within living memory, to a city wrapped in grey skies and darker secrets. To the Pacific Northwest of the 1980s, where beneath the constant drizzle and the roar of departing aircraft, death walked the neon-lit streets with terrible purpose. Before we begin this descent into Seattle's longest nightmare, I ask only this: where do you listen from tonight? What hour keeps you company? And if this story finds you in the darkness, if it accompanies you towards sleep or through the small hours of morning, consider subscribing to this channel. Let us be your guides through history's shadowed corridors, night after night, as we uncover the truths that time has tried to bury. Now then, let us drift backward to the summer of 1982, to a stretch of road where young women disappeared like smoke, and to the river that would give a killer his name. The Pacific Highway South ran like a vein through the southern reaches of King County, Washington, a 6-lane arterial that connected Seattle to the sprawl of Tacoma 30 miles distant. In the early 1980s, this corridor had earned itself a dozen unofficial names, none of them spoken in polite company. The Strip, the Sea-Tac Strip, the Track. It stretched for several miles through the municipalities of Sea-Tac, Kent, and Des Moines. A landscape of low-rent motels with names like the Three Bears and the Ben Carroll, truck stops open 24 hours, fast food restaurants with parking lots that never quite emptied, and taverns with blacked-out windows. Above it all, every 90 seconds, commercial aircraft descended towards Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, their landing lights cutting through the perpetual mist, their engines drowning out the sounds of the street below. This was working territory. Not the downtown core where businessmen moved through glass towers, nor the residential neighborhoods where families tended lawns and painted fences. This was the geography of the dispossessed and the transient, the place where Interstate 5 met desperate circumstance, where young women stood beneath flickering streetlights in tight jeans and heels, waiting for cars to slow. Prostitution had claimed the Strip as its domain through the 1970s and into the 1980s, visible and undisguised. The motels rented rooms by the hour, the massage parlors advertised in the back pages of alternative newspapers, and the women worked the sidewalks in all weather, moving from one sodium vapor pool of light to the next, cigarettes glowing orange in the darkness between. They were young, most of them, 16, 17, 22. Some had run from broken homes in small towns across Washington, Oregon, Idaho. Others had aged out of foster care with nowhere to turn and no skills the legitimate economy valued. A handful came from middle-class suburbs, drawn by drugs or boyfriends or the hollow promise of easy money. All of them had learned quickly that society had written them off before they even understood the terms of the contract. When they vanished, Few would notice. When they died, fewer still would mourn. The killer understood this arithmetic perfectly. The summer of 1982 arrived late to the Pacific Northwest, as it often did. June brought more rain than usual, the temperatures hovering in the low 60s even as the rest of the nation baked. On the Strip, the women worked through drizzle and downpour, their makeup running, their hair plastered to their skulls. The airport traffic never slowed. The trucks kept rolling south toward Portland or north toward Vancouver. And somewhere among the anonymous vehicles that cruised Pacific Highway South, a hunter had begun his selection process. Wendy Lee Caulfield was 16 years old when she disappeared on July 13th. She had been working the Strip for only a few months, a runaway from Puyallup trying to support herself the only way she knew how. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with dark eyes and a nervous laugh. She told the other girls she wanted to save enough money to get to California. On that July evening, she climbed into a vehicle near South 216th Street. No one recorded the make or model. No one thought to look twice. Girls got into cars every night. That was the business. Her body surfaced in the Green River 2 days later. The Green River wound through the southern suburbs of Seattle like a question mark, a rain-swollen waterway that drained the Cascade foothills and emptied eventually into Puget Sound. It was a working river, flanked by industrial parks and gravel operations, crossed by utilitarian bridges, its banks thick with alder and blackberry bramble. Fishermen knew it. Teenagers swam in its deeper pools during the brief northwest summers, and on the morning of July 15th, 2 boys riding bicycles along the riverbank near the Peck Bridge spotted something pale bobbing in the shallows near a cluster of pilings. King County Sheriff's deputies arrived within the hour. They waded into the cold water and retrieved the body of Wendy Caulfield, fully clothed, her skin already taking on the waxy pallor of immersion. The medical examiner would later determine she had been strangled. There were no defensive wounds, no sign of prolonged struggle. She had been killed quickly, efficiently, and dumped into the river within hours of her death. One body did not yet constitute a pattern. The King County Sheriff's Office opened an investigation, canvassed the Strip, spoke to the other working girls who knew Wendy by sight if not by name. They learned little. The women who worked Pacific Highway South had learned long ago not to trust police, not to volunteer information, not to make themselves visible to authority. They answered questions with shrugs and smoke. They remembered nothing useful. Within a week, the investigation had stalled. Then the river gave up another body. Deborah Lynn Bonner, 23 years old, disappeared from the Strip on July 25th. Her body was found floating near Meeker Street on August 12th, strangled, dumped in the river, no witnesses, no leads. Marcia Faye Chapman, 31, vanished on August 1st. Her body was discovered on August 15th, pulled from the Green River near the Interstate 5 bridge, strangled. Cynthia Jean Hines, 17, disappeared on August 11th. She was found on August 15th, the same day as Chapman, her body wedged against the same riverbank, less than 30 feet away, strangled. Opal Charmaine Mills, 16, went missing on August 12th. Her body surfaced on August 15th. Same location, same method. Strangled and discarded like refuse into the cold water, August 15th, 1982. 4 bodies in one location on one day. The Green River had become a dumping ground, and the message was unmistakable. Someone was hunting the women of the Strip with systematic precision. Someone was killing them faster than investigators could even identify the dead. And someone had just announced, through the terrible mathematics of corpses, that he had no intention of stopping. The King County Sheriff, Vern Thomas, called a press conference on August 16th. The local television station sent cameras. The Seattle Times dispatched reporters. Thomas stood before the microphones in his uniform, his face drawn with the weight of what he had to announce. The deaths were connected, he confirmed. A serial killer was operating in King County. The FBI had been contacted. A task force was being assembled, and the women working Pacific Highway South were in mortal danger. The story led every newscast that evening. By morning, it had spread across the nation. Seattle, the Emerald City, the progressive jewel of the Pacific Northwest, had become the stalking ground for a predator the media immediately christened the Green River Killer. The name stuck like blood to water. And as summer turned to autumn, as the rain returned in earnest and the grey skies settled low over Puget Sound, The body count continued to rise. The strip did not empty. Despite the warnings, despite the horror, the women continued to work. They had rent to pay, children to feed, drug habits that demanded constant feeding. They had pimps who beat them for lost revenue and nowhere else to turn. Fear was a luxury they could not afford, so they stood beneath the streetlights as autumn deepened, watching the cars slow, trying to read the faces of men through rain-streaked windshields, attempting impossible calculations of risk and survival. Some carried knives, others worked in pairs. Most simply hoped their luck would hold one more night, one more week, one more month. But the killer moved among them like a ghost, indistinguishable from the steady parade of Johns who cruised the strip nightly. He had a vehicle. He had charm enough to convince terrified women to trust him, and he had a method refined through repetition into something approaching ritual. He picked them up, he killed them, he disposed of their bodies with the casual efficiency of someone taking out trash. And then he returned to hunt again. By October, the Green River Task Force had grown to 25 detectives. By November, 40. They worked from a makeshift headquarters in a county building in Burien, surrounded by filing cabinets stuffed with tips, witness statements, and autopsy reports. They compiled lists of known sex offenders. They interviewed hundreds of men who had been seen on the strip. They followed up on psychic visions and anonymous letters and desperate hunches. And still, the women kept disappearing. Still, the bodies kept turning up in the river, in the woods, in vacant lots where blackberry brambles grew thick enough to hide the dead. Detective Dave Reichert, a 32-year-old investigator who had grown up in the area, became the public face of the task force. He was tall and angular, with the weathered features of someone who spent his days tramping through forest undergrowth and standing in the rain. He gave the press conferences. He coordinated with the FBI's behavioral science unit. He stood at crime scenes while technicians photographed remains, trying to understand the mind that could commit such acts with such regularity. And late at night, alone in his office, he stared at photographs of the victims, young faces frozen in happier moments, and wondered how many more would join them before this ended. The killer did not discriminate beyond his victim type. Black girls, white girls, mixed race. Blondes, brunettes, redheads, teenagers and women in their 30s. The only commonality was profession and location. They worked the strip, they were vulnerable, they were invisible to the broader community. And they were dying at a rate that suggested the killer had refined his process to the point of compulsion. This was not opportunistic violence. This was systematic extermination. As winter approached and the rain turned colder, as the days shortened and the night stretched long over Seattle, the Green River Task Force worked in a state of exhausted desperation. They knew the killer was still active. They knew he was choosing new victims even as they processed evidence from the previous murders. They knew that somewhere in the greater Seattle area, a man with unremarkable features and deadly purpose was living an ordinary life, going to work, perhaps coming home to a family, all while carrying the weight of multiple murders like a secret kept in the deepest pocket of his soul. And they knew, with mounting dread, that they might never find him in time to save the next woman who climbed into his vehicle on a rain-soaked night along Pacific Highway South. The strip glittered in the darkness, neon reflecting off wet pavement. The planes descended toward the airport in their endless procession, and the women stood in the cold, waiting for cars to slow, playing a lottery where the only prize was survival until dawn. Chapter 2. The River Speaks. The Green River had witnessed a century of human industry before it became a graveyard. Loggers had once floated timber down its currents toward the mills of Elliott Bay. Farmers had drawn water from its flow to irrigate the valley bottomlands. Children had waded in its shallows on summer afternoons, catching crawdads and skipping stones across its surface. By the 1980s, the river had been diminished by development, channeled and constrained, its banks hardened with concrete in some stretches, choked with invasive vegetation in others. It was no longer picturesque. It was functional, utilitarian, largely ignored except by the gravel companies that worked its floodplain and the occasional fishermen who knew where the steelhead still ran. But in August of 1982, the Green River commanded attention unlike anything in its history. What had been a minor waterway threading through the southern suburbs became the focal point of the largest criminal investigation the Pacific Northwest had ever mounted. The river had accepted what had been given to it, bodies released into its current with the expectation that water would do what water always did: carry things away, dissolve evidence, erase the traces of violence. Instead, the river had spoken. It had returned the dead to the living, and in doing so, it had announced that something monstrous was unfolding in King County. The discovery of 5 bodies between July 15th and August 15th forced a reckoning within the King County Sheriff's Office. The department was accustomed to investigating individual homicides, domestic violence turned fatal, bar fights that ended in stabbing, the occasional gang-related shooting. They were not prepared for a predator operating on this scale. Serial murder was still relatively rare in American policing in 1982. The term itself had only gained widespread usage in the previous decade. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, tucked away in the basement of the Training Academy in Quantico, Virginia, was still developing the psychological profiles and investigative techniques that would later become standard. And in Seattle, a city that prided itself on its progressive values and natural beauty, the reality that a serial killer was hunting women within sight of the airport induced a kind of civic shock that manifested as disbelief, then anger, then grinding determination. On August 17, 1982, Sheriff Vern Thomas formally announced the creation of the Green River Task Force. He assigned 25 detectives to the effort, pulling them from other divisions, cancelling vacations, authorizing overtime without limit. The task force established headquarters in a county facility on Ambon Boulevard in Burien, a nondescript building that would become the nerve center of an investigation spanning 2 decades. Within days, the walls were covered with maps, timelines, victim photographs, and hand-drawn charts attempting to find pattern in chaos. Filing cabinets multiplied, telephones rang constantly with tips, sightings, confessions from attention seekers, and calls from terrified families wondering if their missing daughters might be among the unidentified dead. Detective Dave Reichert was named lead investigator. He was young for such responsibility, but he possessed qualities the brass valued. He was tireless, detail-oriented, and he genuinely cared about the victims in a way that transcended professional obligation. Reichert had grown up in the rural areas south of Seattle, had hunted and fished these same woods and rivers as a boy. He knew the terrain intimately. More importantly, he understood that the women being killed were human beings, not statistics, not throwaway people whose deaths mattered less because of how they earned money. This moral clarity would sustain him through the years of frustration ahead. The first task was identification. Several of the bodies pulled from the river had been in the water long enough that visual identification was impossible. Fingerprints were compromised. Dental records required knowing who to look for in the first place. The task force compiled lists of missing women reported from the Sea-Tac Strip, from Seattle proper, from Tacoma, and the smaller communities scattered across the region. They cross-referenced ages, physical descriptions, clothing when available. Slowly, names attached to remains: Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, Marsha Chapman, Cynthia Hines, Opal Mills. Each name represented a life cut short, a family now grieving, a story that ended in cold water and strangling hands. The autopsies revealed consistencies that pointed toward a single killer. All 5 women found in August had been manually strangled. No ligatures, no weapons. Bare hands crushing windpipes until breath stopped and life fled. The medical examiner noted petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, fractures to the hyoid bones in several cases, bruising patterns on the necks that suggested the killer approached from behind or while the victims were incapacitated. There was evidence of sexual assault in some cases, though the water had destroyed much forensic material. What remained indicated the killer was methodical. He controlled his victims quickly. He killed them relatively soon after abduction. And he disposed of bodies within hours, sometimes dumping multiple victims in rapid succession. The geographic profile began to emerge through September and October as more bodies were discovered. The killer was not limiting himself to the river. On September 26th, hunters found skeletal remains in a remote area off Star Lake Road, several miles from the Green River itself. The body was identified as Giselle Lovorn, 19 years old, missing since July 17th. On October 15th, another set of remains turned up near South 192nd Street and Military Road, in a wooded area accessible only by rough trails. This victim remained unidentified for months, known only as Jane Doe B10 in the task force records. The killer, investigators realized, had established dump sites. The river had been his initial choice, convenient and efficient, but he had expanded his method. Now he was hiding bodies in the dense second-growth forest that surrounded Seattle, places where logging had stripped the land decades earlier and nature had returned in thick, impenetrable tangles of alder, maple, salal, and blackberry. These were not parks or hiking trails. These were forgotten margins, the spaces between developments, roadside parcels too steep or too wet for construction, the kind of terrain that could hide a body for months or years, and the killer knew them intimately. Task force detectives began the grim work of searching these areas. They walked grid patterns through the underbrush, pushing aside brambles, turning over logs, looking for the telltale signs of human remains. They brought in cadaver dogs that picked up scent signatures invisible to human perception. They enlisted volunteers, civilian search and rescue teams who spent weekends combing through muddy ravines and overgrown clearings, and they found more bodies. October gave up 3, November 2, December 1. By the end of 1982, the confirmed victim count stood at 16 women, with several more missing and presumed dead. The press coverage intensified with each discovery. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer ran daily updates. The Seattle Times published lengthy features exploring the lives of the victims, attempting to humanize women that society had already dehumanized. Local television stations sent reporters to stand along the Green River or at the edges of forest search sites, delivering somber reports with the grey northwest sky as backdrop. And the story spread nationally. Time magazine ran a piece. Network news broadcasts included segments. The Green River Killer became shorthand for a particular kind of modern horror, the predator who hunted society's most vulnerable with impunity. The FBI involvement brought resources and expertise. Special agents from the Behavioral Science Unit traveled to Seattle and met with task force detectives, reviewing evidence and constructing a psychological profile. The killer, they concluded, was likely a white male in his 20s or 30s. He would be employed, probably in a blue-collar occupation that gave him freedom of movement. He might have military or security experience, given the efficiency of his methods. He would appear ordinary, even friendly, able to convince frightened women to trust him. He was organized, controlled, and likely living a conventional life that provided perfect camouflage. He probably had a residence or access to property where he could take victims without being observed, and critically, he was not going to stop. The compulsion that drove him was too strong, too deeply rooted. He would continue killing until he was caught or until external circumstances forced him to cease. This profile described thousands of men in the Seattle metropolitan area. It was both useful and maddeningly vague. Task force detectives began the laborious process of identifying suspects, interviewing persons of interest, eliminating names from consideration one by one. They looked at registered sex offenders. They investigated men who'd been arrested for soliciting prostitutes. They followed up on tips from citizens who reported suspicious neighbors or co-workers. The task force database swelled with names, vehicles, alibis, statements, and still the killer eluded them. The women of the Strip lived in a state of sustained terror that autumn. Some left Seattle entirely, taking buses to Portland or San Francisco or Los Angeles, hoping that distance would provide safety. Others moved indoors, working for escort services or massage parlors, where there was at least the illusion of security. But most continued working the street because they had no alternative. The economic desperation that had brought them to prostitution in the first place had not diminished. They needed money daily, so they stood beneath the streetlights, more cautious now, trying to screen clients, asking other girls to note license plate numbers, but ultimately still climbing into vehicles with strangers because survival demanded it. The killer adapted. As the autumn rains intensified and the nights grew longer, he changed his pattern slightly. He began transporting bodies farther from the initial dump sites. Remains started appearing in more remote locations, up logging roads in the Cascade foothills, in national forest land where hikers rarely ventured. He was learning from the investigation, adjusting his methods, staying ahead of the detectives who pursued him. And he continued killing. November brought 3 more disappearances from the Strip. December 2. January of 1983 began with another missing girl, 16 years old, last seen climbing into a pickup truck near Pacific Highway South and South 216th Street. By early 1983, the Green River Task Force had expanded to 40 detectives and support staff. The investigation consumed resources at an unprecedented rate. The county budget strained under the weight of overtime costs, laboratory analysis, and search operations. There was talk of requesting state assistance, of appealing to the governor for emergency funding. Meanwhile, the task force worked 100-hour weeks, following leads that dissolved into dead ends, watching the victim count climb month after month, feeling the weight of failure even as they gave everything they had to the hunt. Dave Reichert stood at the edge of the Green River one cold morning in February 1983, watching the water slide past, grey and unreadable. Behind him, a team of divers prepared to search a section of riverbed where a tip had suggested another body might be submerged. The rain fell steadily, as it had fallen for days, as it would fall for months more. Somewhere in the greater Seattle area, a man was going about his ordinary life, invisible among 3 million people, protected by his very normality. He had killed at least 20 women, probably more. He would kill again before spring arrived. And despite the largest investigation in the region's history, despite the resources and expertise and desperate determination, he remained a ghost, a shadow, a name attached to a river that kept surrendering the dead but never the killer himself. The divers entered the water, the search continued, and the rain fell on, indifferent and cold, washing the evidence away even as it was gathered, dissolving the traces of violence into the eternal grey of the Pacific Northwest winter. Chapter 3. The Invisible Women. They had names, though the newspapers often omitted them. They had histories, though few took the time to record them. They had families who loved them, dreams that had died slowly or all at once, childhoods that had contained laughter and ordinary hope before circumstance and misfortune redirected their paths toward the neon-lit margins of Pacific Highway South. The women who died at the hands of the Green River Killer were not abstractions. They were daughters and sisters and mothers. They were human beings whose humanity had been discounted long before their murders, rendered invisible by the work they did and the spaces they occupied, and in their invisibility lay their vulnerability, a fact the killer understood and exploited with terrible precision. Wendy Lee Caulfield had been the first to die that investigators knew of, though later evidence would suggest others had preceded her. She was born in 1966 in Tacoma, the second of 4 children in a family that struggled with poverty and instability. Her father left when she was young. Her mother worked multiple jobs to keep the household afloat. Wendy was bright in elementary school, a girl who loved animals and drawing, who talked about becoming a veterinarian when she grew up. But adolescence brought turbulence. She clashed with her mother's boyfriend. She struggled academically. At 14, she began running away, disappearing for days at a time, returning thin and evasive about where she had been. The pattern repeated through her 15th year. School became irregular. Home became a place she could not bear. And somewhere in that chaos, someone introduced her to the economics of survival on the street. By 16, Wendy was working the strip. She had a friend, another runaway who showed her where to stand, how to negotiate, which motels would rent rooms to teenagers with cash. Wendy hated it. She told the other girls she was saving money to get to California, though the money never accumulated, consumed always by immediate need. Food, cigarettes, a place to sleep. The small comforts that made the nights bearable. She'd been on the street less than 3 months when she climbed into a vehicle on July 13, 1982. 2 days later, she floated in the Green River. Her dreams of California dissolved into the cold water that carried her toward Puget Sound. Deborah Bonner had been 23 when she vanished, older than most of the victims, a woman rather than a girl. She had grown up in Tacoma in a working-class neighborhood where her parents owned a small house and maintained the kind of stable, unremarkable life that was supposed to insulate children from danger. Deborah graduated high school. She held legitimate jobs, working retail, waitressing, trying to build something that resembled a future. But she developed a heroin addiction in her early 20s, and the addiction consumed everything. She lost her apartment, she burned through savings. Her family tried intervention, rehab, ultimatums. Nothing held. By the summer of 1982, Deborah was living week to week in cheap motels along the Strip, supporting her habit through prostitution because nothing else generated money quickly enough to satisfy the craving that governed her life. She was found in the Green River on August 12th, another casualty of the invisible war that addiction wages on the human soul. Marcia Chapman was 31, a mother of 3 children who had been placed in foster care after the state determined she could no longer provide adequate housing or stability. Marcia had married young, divorced young, remarried, divorced again. She had worked as a waitress, a housekeeper, a cook in institutional kitchens. She had periods of sobriety and periods of relapse. Her family described her as sweet-natured, generous to a fault, someone who gave away her last dollar to anyone with a sadder story. But life had worn her down through incremental defeats, and by her late 20s she had drifted into prostitution as a means of temporary survival that became permanent circumstance. She wrote letters to her children that she never sent, promising she would get clean and reclaim them, that they would be a family again. On August 1st, 1982, she disappeared from the Strip. 2 weeks later, she was pulled from the river, and her children became orphans in all but name. Cynthia Hines was 17, a girl with a brilliant smile and talent for singing. She had grown up in foster care, passed between homes, never finding the stability or affection that might have anchored her. She aged out of the system at 16 with no job skills, no family support, and no housing. For 2 months, she tried to survive through legitimate means, applying for work, staying in shelters, but the mathematics of poverty defeated her. Rent required first and last month plus deposit. Employers wanted experience. Shelters had waiting lists and rules that were difficult to follow for someone with no place to store belongings and no way to maintain hygiene or appropriate clothing. Cynthia drifted to the Strip because other girls told her it was possible to make rent money in a single night. She worked for 3 weeks before she vanished on August 11th. Her body was found 4 days later, one of the cluster discovered on August 15th, another young life abbreviated before it had truly begun. Opal Mills had been 16 years old, small for her age, a girl who looked younger than her years, which made her popular with certain clients and more vulnerable to exploitation. She had run away from a group home in Portland, traveling to Seattle with a boyfriend who promised her a place to stay and then abandoned her within a week. Opal was terrified of returning to state custody. She had spent her childhood warehoused in institutions, and the prospect of going back induced a panic that overrode every other consideration. So she stayed on the street, working the Strip, sleeping in alleys or stairwells when she could not afford a motel, trying to remain invisible to police and social workers. She was picked up on August 12th. Her body went into the river that night, discovered 3 days later, another teenager erased before she had the chance to escape the circumstances that had trapped her. The pattern repeated across the victim list. Girls from broken homes, women with addiction issues, runaways fleeing abuse, mothers separated from their children. Every one of them had arrived at the Strip through a series of circumstances that our society creates and then refuses to acknowledge. They were not there because of moral failure or poor choices, convenient judgments that allowed the comfortable to dismiss them. They were there because the safety net had failed, because mental health services were inadequate, because addiction treatment was inaccessible, because minimum wage could not cover rent, because foster care aged out teenagers with no support, because domestic violence offered few real escapes, because the economy had no use for people without credentials or connections or family wealth to fall back upon. The killer understood this perfectly. He chose his victims from a population that had already been abandoned by the systems meant to protect them. When these women disappeared, days or weeks might pass before anyone filed a missing person report. They had no employers to notice their absence, no landlords waiting for rent. Often their families had lost contact or given up hope years earlier. The other girls working the Strip might note someone had not been seen recently, but they themselves were transient, moving between cities, getting arrested, dying of overdoses or violence. Memory was unreliable in that world, and even when someone did report a woman missing, police response was often minimal. Another runaway, another junkie, another prostitute who probably just moved to another city. The reports piled up in file cabinets, low priority, rarely investigated with any urgency. This societal indifference created a hunting ground where a predator could operate with remarkable freedom. The killer could abduct women from the Strip without triggering immediate alarm. He could murder them and dispose of their bodies at his leisure, confident that days or weeks would pass before anyone connected the disappearance to foul play. And even when bodies were discovered, the investigation faced obstacles that murders of other victims would not encounter. These women had no stable residences to search for evidence. They had no co-workers who had noticed them leave with someone. They kept no calendars or appointment books. Their lives were lived in cash, in the moment, leaving minimal paper trail. Witnesses were scarce and reluctant to talk. The community that might have demanded justice was fractured and voiceless. The families of the victims struggled to make their daughters and sisters visible. Some spoke to reporters, sharing photographs from happier times, birthday parties and school pictures and holidays before everything fell apart. They described the daughters they remembered, before the drugs or the streets, before circumstance had narrowed options to nothing. But the media coverage often carried an implicit suggestion that these deaths were somehow less tragic than they would have been had the victims been college students or nurses or secretaries. The language gave it away. High-risk lifestyle, known prostitute, history of drug use. These phrases appeared in nearly every article, subtle signals that the reader need not grieve too deeply, that these deaths occupied a different category of loss. Detective Dave Reichert recognized this dynamic and fought against it. In his public statements, he emphasized the humanity of the victims. He used their names. He spoke about their families. He reminded reporters that these were someone's daughters, that they had been killed through no fault of their own, that every human life possessed equal value regardless of how it was being lived when it ended. Some of the other detectives thought this focus was sentimental, a waste of energy that should be directed toward catching the killer. But Reichert understood that solving these murders required public engagement, and public engagement required the community to care about the victims. If the women remained abstractions, nameless prostitutes whose deaths merited a few paragraphs in the Metro section, the tips would not come in, the pressure would not build, the resources would not flow, the victims had to become real. By the spring of 1983, the confirmed victim count had reached 26. Another dozen women were missing from the Strip, their fates unknown but grimly suspected. The task force maintained a wall covered with photographs, every victim given equal space, their faces looking out at the detectives who worked 18-hour days trying to find their killer. Some of the photos showed young women smiling, caught in moments of joy that now seemed impossibly distant. Others were surveillance images or booking photos, faces hardened by experience, eyes that had seen too much. And some were sketches, reconstructions based on skeletal remains, approximations of features that might help someone recognize a daughter or sister who had vanished months or years earlier. The women still working the Strip knew these faces. They had been friends, acquaintances, the girl who worked the next corner over. They attended informal memorials when bodies were identified, standing in small clusters near the river or in the parking lots of the motels where the dead had once rented rooms. They left flowers and candles and photographs. They cried and held each other and then went back to work because survival permitted no other choice. And they lived with the knowledge that any car might contain the killer, that any client might be the one who would strangle them and dump them in the woods. They carried this terror like a weight that grew heavier each day, each week, each month, that the killer remained free. The invisibility that had made these women vulnerable was slowly being challenged by the sheer scale of the killing. 26 dead, a dozen more missing. Numbers that could not be dismissed or ignored. The media coverage that had begun as sporadic local news had become sustained national attention. The FBI had assigned additional resources. The state legislature was being pressured to provide emergency funding, and families across the country whose daughters had run away or disappeared were calling the task force hotline, terrified that their missing child might be among the unidentified remains. But recognition came too late for the women who had already died. They had lived and worked in the shadows, and they had died there, strangled by hands that exploited the very marginalization that society had imposed upon them. Their names deserved remembering. Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, Opal Mills, Giselle Love Vaughan, and 20 others by the spring of 1983, with more to follow before the killing finally stopped. They had been invisible in life. In death, they became testimony to the consequences of indifference, to the human cost of abandoning the vulnerable, to the terrible efficiency of a predator who understood exactly which prey society would not defend. The rain continued through that spring, washing the streets of the Strip, falling on the forest dump sites where remains still lay undiscovered, drumming against the roof of the task force headquarters where detectives worked through another night. And somewhere in the darkness, the killer moved through his ordinary life, protected by normalcy, by the vast anonymity of the city, by the terrible fact that he looked like anyone else, and the women he hunted had been rendered invisible long before he found them. Chapter 4. The Hunt Begins. The Green River Task Force headquarters on Ambon Boulevard in Burien had the atmosphere of a military campaign in its desperate phase. By March of 1983, 40 detectives worked in shifts around the clock, their desks crammed into rooms never designed for such occupation. The walls had disappeared beneath maps and timelines and victim photographs. Whiteboards tracked hundreds of potential suspects, each name connected by lines and notes to sightings, tips, alibis, eliminations. The smell of coffee and stale cigarettes permeated everything. The fluorescent lights never dimmed, and the telephones rang without cease, tips pouring in from across the region, the nation, each one requiring documentation, assessment, follow-up, most leading nowhere but demanding hours of work to confirm their worthlessness. Detective Dave Reichert had become the embodiment of the investigation. His face appeared regularly on television, appealing for information, announcing new developments, standing at press conferences beside the sheriff or the FBI agents who rotated through Seattle offering expertise and resources. Reichert was only 33 years old, but the investigation had aged him visibly. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His hair had begun showing grey at the temples. He moved through his days with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every hour wasted might cost another life, that somewhere beyond the reach of his knowledge the killer was hunting, selecting, killing, and there was nothing Reichert could do to stop him until something broke. Some piece of evidence or stroke of luck that would finally give the investigation the opening it desperately needed. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit had provided a detailed profile that shaped the investigation's direction. The killer was almost certainly a white male between 25 and 35 years old. He would be of average or above average intelligence. He would be employed in a job that provided autonomy and freedom of movement, possibly something involving driving or delivery work that would explain his presence on the Strip without raising suspicion. He would appear normal to neighbors and co-workers, perhaps even friendly and helpful. The kind of person no one would suspect of harboring violent compulsions. He might have a military or law enforcement background, given his ability to control victims and avoid leaving forensic evidence. He would likely live alone or with a partner who was unaware of his activities, maintaining a separate space where he could take victims without being observed or interrupted. Most significantly, the profile suggested the killer had a deep hatred of women, particularly prostitutes. This was not sexually motivated crime in the conventional sense. The sexual assaults appeared almost perfunctory, secondary to the act of killing itself. What drove this man was rage, a need to dominate and destroy, focused on a specific category of victim that he had dehumanized completely in his own mind. He was not killing people, he was killing prostitutes, a distinction that made the murders psychologically easier for him and practically safer in terms of societal response. He had calculated correctly that the deaths of these particular women would generate less investigation, less public outcry, less pressure on law enforcement than if he had chosen victims from other demographics. Armed with this profile, the task force began the systematic work of identifying suspects. They started with known sex offenders, men with histories of violence against women. King County had hundreds of such men on file. Each one required investigation. Detectives knocked on doors, conducted interviews, checked alibis, requested voluntary samples for blood typing, since DNA analysis was still in its infancy and unavailable for routine use. Most of the men cooperated, eager to clear their names, understanding that refusal would only increase suspicion. Some lawyered up immediately. A few fled when detectives approached, triggering manhunts that consumed days before the suspect was located and cleared through alibi verification. The task force also focused on men who had been arrested for soliciting prostitutes on the Strip. If the killer was selecting victims from that specific location, he was likely a regular presence there, someone the women might have seen repeatedly, perhaps even someone who had paid for sex before escalating to murder. Vice Division records provided hundreds of names. detectives cross-referenced these against the dates of known disappearances, looking for patterns. Had any particular John been arrested shortly before or after a victim vanished? Were there men who appeared in multiple arrest records, habitual clients whose presence on the Strip was documented over months or years? One name that surfaced during this process was Gary Leon Ridgway. He was 33 years old in 1983, married, employed as a painter at a Kenworth truck manufacturing plant in Renton. He lived in a modest house in Auburn, south of Seattle, a working-class community of single-family homes and strip malls. On April 30th, 1982, 3 months before Wendy Caufield's body was found in the Green River, Ridgway had been arrested for soliciting an undercover police officer posing as a prostitute on the Strip. The charge was a misdemeanor. He paid a fine and was released. The arrest was noted in his file but carried no particular weight. Thousands of men were arrested annually for the same offence. It indicated presence on the Strip, nothing more. But in May of 1983, the task force received a call that elevated Ridgway to person of interest status. A woman who worked the Strip contacted the tip line. She said she had dated Gary Ridgway briefly, that he had been a client who became something more, though the relationship had ended badly. She described him as obsessed with prostitutes, someone who talked constantly about the women on the Strip, who cruised the area compulsively even when he was supposedly in a committed relationship. More disturbingly, she said Ridgway had once attempted to strangle her during sex, choking her until she lost consciousness. When she confronted him afterward, he claimed it had been an accident, that he did not realize his own strength, but she had been terrified enough to break off all contact. She had not reported the incident at the time, fearing police would not take a prostitute's complaint seriously. But with the Green River killings dominating the news, she felt compelled to call. Detectives interviewed Ridgway on May 6, 1983. They met him at his workplace during a lunch break, conducting the interview in an unused conference room at the Kenworth plant. Ridgway was short, 5'10", with brown hair and a slight build. His hands were stained with paint. He wore thick glasses that magnified his eyes slightly, giving him an owlish appearance. He was polite, cooperative, almost eager to help. Yes, he admitted, he had been arrested for solicitation. He was embarrassed about that. It had been a mistake, a moment of weakness. He had stopped going to the Strip after the arrest. His wife did not know about it, and he hoped the detectives would be discreet. He understood they had to investigate everyone, and he bore them no ill will for asking questions. Did he know any of the victims? The detectives showed him photographs. Ridgway studied each one carefully, shaking his head. Maybe he had seen some of them on the Strip before his arrest, but he could not be certain. The women all looked similar to him, he said, which was perhaps not the most tactful thing to say, but seemed to be honest confusion rather than callousness. Where had he been on specific dates? He could not remember most of them. He worked Monday through Friday, regular hours. Weekends he spent at home or doing yard work. Sometimes he went fishing. His wife could verify his whereabouts most evenings. He seemed genuinely puzzled about why he was being questioned, and the detectives found themselves halfway convinced of his innocence even as they went through the routine questions. They asked about the strangulation allegation from his former girlfriend. Ridgway's expression shifted, became guarded. He acknowledged knowing the woman, though he characterized their relationship differently than she had. They had gone out a few times, nothing serious. He denied ever hurting her. If she claimed otherwise, she was lying or misremembering. Perhaps she was angry he had ended things. Women could be vindictive when rejected. The detectives noted the subtle shift in his demeanor when discussing women. A slight edge that entered his voice, but it was hardly damning. Many men held resentful views about women without becoming killers. The interview lasted 90 minutes. Ridgway returned to work. The detectives wrote up their notes and filed the report. Ridgway remained on the list of persons of interest, but he was not prioritized. He had alibis for at least some of the disappearance dates, provided by his wife and co-workers. He had passed a voluntary polygraph examination administered by an independent examiner, though polygraphs were notoriously unreliable and carried little evidentiary weight. Most significantly, he did not match the demeanor investigators expected from the killer. Ridgway seemed ordinary to the point of blandness, a man whose most notable quality was his lack of notable qualities. The FBI profile suggested someone more controlled, more intelligent, more capable of compartmentalization. Ridgway came across as simple, guileless, almost childlike in his eagerness to please. The detectives moved on to other suspects. The investigation consumed 1983 and rolled into 1984 with no breakthrough. The task force interviewed more than 5,000 men. They followed up on 18,000 tips called into the hotline. They searched hundreds of locations based on psychic visions, anonymous letters, and painstaking geographic analysis of dump sites. They walked grid patterns through thousands of acres of forest. They dove in the Green River until they knew every submerged log and piece of rusted machinery on the bottom. They worked with anthropologists to analyze skeletal remains found in the woods, establishing identities through dental records and clothing fragments, and still the killer eluded them. The bodies continued to surface through 1983, though at a slower pace than the terrible cluster of August 1982. 2 in March, 1 in April, 3 in May. By December, the confirmed count had reached 41 victims. Another 8 women were missing and presumed dead, though their bodies had not been located. The killer was still active, still selecting victims from the strip, though his method had evolved. He was no longer using the Green River as a primary dump site. The intense police presence near the water had made that too risky. Instead, he transported bodies farther into the Cascade foothills, up logging roads that saw traffic once a week at most, into ravines where blackberry brambles grew 15 feet high and a body could lie undiscovered for years. The investigation's frustration manifested in different ways across the task force. Some detectives burned out and requested transfers back to regular duties, unable to sustain the emotional toll of working a case that generated only corpses and dead ends. Others became obsessive, working 20-hour days, neglecting families and health, convinced that the next tip or the next search would finally yield the breakthrough. Reichert fell into this second category. His marriage strained under the weight of his absence and preoccupation. His children barely saw him, but he could not walk away. Every time he considered taking a break, another body would be found, and he would be standing in the woods again, watching technicians document remains, knowing that this woman had been alive and terrified in her final moments, that she'd died because he had failed to stop her killer. The media scrutiny intensified through 1984. National news magazines published lengthy investigations exploring how a serial killer could operate with such impunity. Criminologists and psychologists appeared on television offering theories about the killer's psychology, his methods, his potential vulnerabilities. The talk shows featured panels debating whether society's attitude toward prostitutes had enabled the murders, whether the victims' lifestyle choices bore any responsibility for their deaths. These discussions often devolved into victim blaming disguised as sociology, suggestions that women who worked the streets assumed certain risks and should not be surprised by tragic outcomes. The families of the victims watched these programs in anguish, hearing their daughters and sisters reduced to statistics and cautionary tales. In Seattle, public pressure mounted on elected officials to solve the case, or at least demonstrate progress. The King County executive faced criticism at every public appearance. The sheriff's department budget battles became referendums on the investigation's effectiveness. Why had 41 women been killed without a single arrest? How could a killer operate for 2 years without leaving usable evidence? Were the detectives incompetent, or were they simply not trying hard enough because the victims were prostitutes? These questions had no good answers. The truth was that the killer was careful, intelligent, and lucky. He left minimal forensic evidence. He chose victims whose disappearances went unnoticed for days or weeks. He operated in a vast metropolitan area where 3 million people provided perfect camouflage. And despite the task force's enormous effort, despite following every lead and employing every available investigative technique, they had not managed to close the net around him. By late 1984, there were whispers about shutting down the task force, or at least significantly reducing its size. The investigation was consuming resources that the county could barely afford. Other crimes were being neglected as detectives focused exclusively on the Green River murders, and critically, the bodies had stopped appearing. The last confirmed victim had been found in September. October passed without a discovery. November, December. Had the killer finally been caught for some other crime and was sitting in jail somewhere, his connection to the murders unrecognized? Had he moved to another city and begun hunting there? Or was this simply a pause? a temporary cessation that would end when the killer's compulsion overwhelmed his caution once more. Reichert argued forcefully against reducing the investigation. The killer was still out there. The absence of new bodies meant only that they were not being found, not that the killing had stopped. Somewhere in King County or beyond, women were still disappearing, their bodies hidden so well that searchers had not stumbled across them yet. To scale back now would be to abandon the victims, the families, and the next women who would die when the killer resumed his work. The argument prevailed, but barely. The task force was maintained at reduced strength, 20 detectives instead of 40, the budget cut, the urgency diminished by the passage of time and the absence of new horrors to sustain public attention. The investigation entered a long, grinding phase of diminishing returns. Detectives continued following leads, but the quality of tips had declined. Most calls to the hotline now came from the mentally ill or attention seekers confessing to crimes they had not committed. The promising suspects had been cleared. The evidence had been analysed and reanalysed without yielding new insights, and the forest held its secrets, the remains of women still lying undiscovered in the tangled undergrowth, waiting for hikers or hunters, or the slow work of time to bring them back to light. Gary Ridgway continued working at the Kenworth plant, painting trucks, going home to his wife in Auburn. His name remained in the task force database, but he was not considered a priority suspect. He had been interviewed twice, polygraphed, cleared, and life went on, ordinary and unremarkable, while the memory of his victims decomposed in the woods, and the detectives who hunted him grew older and more tired, sustained only by the knowledge that somewhere in the miles of case files and thousands of interview notes, the answer was waiting, if only they could find it before the killer died of natural causes and took his secrets with him into whatever darkness waited beyond this one. Chapter 5. A Face in the Crowd. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, the second of 3 sons in a family that would relocate to Washington State during his childhood. His father, Thomas Ridgway, worked for Kenworth, the truck manufacturing company, a connection that would later provide Gary with employment and a respectable working-class identity. His mother, Mary Rita Ridgway, dominated the household in ways that left scars her sons would carry into adulthood. She was controlling, critical, subject to rages that could erupt without warning over infractions real or imagined. The Ridgway household was not physically violent in the obvious sense, but it was a place where affection was scarce and approval nearly impossible to earn. Gary was an unremarkable child in most respects. He struggled in school, particularly with reading, a difficulty that would persist throughout his life and leave him functionally semi-literate well into adulthood. He was held back a year in elementary school, a humiliation that marked him among his peers. Other children noticed his slowness, his difficulty articulating thoughts, the way he struggled with assignments that others completed easily. He became the target of teasing, though not severe enough to generate intervention from teachers or parents. He learned to exist on the margins of social groups, present but not quite included, tolerated but not befriended. His relationship with his mother was complex and deeply disturbed, though this would not be understood until decades later when psychologists attempted to map the origins of his pathology. Mary Ridgway bathed Gary until he was well into adolescence, an intimacy that crossed boundaries in ways the boy could not articulate, but instinctively understood as wrong. She was physically affectionate in ways that felt invasive rather than comforting. And she disparaged him constantly, criticizing his intelligence, his appearance, his inability to meet standards she never clearly defined. Gary both craved her approval and resented her dominance, a contradiction that generated rage he had no healthy way to express. In his early teens, Gary began exhibiting behaviors that should have raised alarm. He wet the bed until he was 14, a condition often associated with emotional disturbance or trauma. He set fires in the neighborhood, small blazes in garbage cans and vacant lots, acts of destruction that gave him a sense of power and control he lacked in other areas of his life. And at 13, he led a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him, though not fatally. The younger child survived and told his parents. Gary was questioned but denied involvement. Without conclusive evidence and perhaps unwilling to believe a young teenager capable of such violence, the matter was dropped. The incident disappeared into the past, unrecorded in any official file, known only to the families involved and forgotten by everyone except Gary himself, who would later describe the stabbing as his first real attempt to kill. He graduated high school in 1969, an accomplishment that required the lowered standards of the era and the patience of teachers who passed him along, rather than address his learning difficulties. His grades were poor, his prospects were limited. The Vietnam War was consuming young men his age, and Gary enlisted in the Navy immediately after graduation, perhaps seeking escape from his mother's household, perhaps simply following the path of least resistance when no other options presented themselves. He served for 2 years, stationed primarily stateside, working in supply and logistics where his limited literacy was less of a hindrance. He received an honorable discharge in 1971 and returned to Washington State with no particular plans beyond finding work that would support him. He married for the first time in 1970 while still in the Navy, a hasty union with a woman named Claudia Craig who was pregnant with another man's child. The marriage was troubled from the start. Gary was possessive and jealous, accusing Claudia of infidelity without evidence, interrogating her about her whereabouts when they were apart. He was also sexually insatiable in ways that disturbed her, demanding intercourse multiple times daily, in locations and circumstances that felt compulsive rather than passionate. When she refused or expressed discomfort, he became sullen and withdrawn, punishing her through silence. The marriage lasted less than a year. Claudia left in 1971, taking her child, seeking divorce on grounds of incompatibility, though the truth was darker than the legal language suggested. Gary returned to the Seattle area permanently in 1971 and found work through his father's connections at Kenworth. He was hired as a painter in the truck assembly operation, a job that required no advanced skills and offered union wages sufficient to rent a small apartment and maintain a vehicle. He was a reliable employee, showing up on time, following instructions, causing no trouble. His supervisors considered him slow but steady, the kind of worker who would never be promoted but would never need to be fired. He existed in the vast middle range of industrial labor, invisible among hundreds of other men doing similar work for similar pay. He married again in 1973, this time to a woman named Marcia Winslow who worked at a department store. This marriage lasted slightly longer than the first, producing a son in 1975, but the same patterns emerged. Gary's sexual demands were constant and strange. He wanted sex in public places, in his truck parked in shopping mall lots, in the woods during hikes, anywhere the risk of discovery added an element of danger. He also began soliciting prostitutes regularly, spending money the family could barely afford on encounters with women who worked the various strips and track areas around Seattle. When Marcia discovered receipts and confronted him, Gary admitted to the prostitution, but claimed it meant nothing, that these women were not real to him, that they provided a service like any other transaction. The distinction did not comfort Marcia. She filed for divorce in 1980, taking their son, leaving Gary alone in the small house he had purchased in Auburn. By 1980, Gary Ridgway was 31 years old, twice divorced, living alone, working a dead-end job that would be his employment for the next 2 decades. To his neighbors, he was unremarkable. He kept his lawn trimmed. He waved when passing on the street. He attended a local Pentecostal church regularly, sitting in the back rows singing hymns in his off-key voice, occasionally offering testimony about his faith during evening services. His religious conversion had occurred during his second marriage, a brief period when he and Marcia had attended church together in an attempt to repair their relationship. After the divorce, Gary continued attending alone, finding in the evangelical community an acceptance he had rarely experienced elsewhere. The church members knew he was divorced, knew he struggled with what they termed sexual sin, but they embraced him as a sinner seeking redemption, which was the entire point of their faith. The contradiction between his church attendance and his compulsive use of prostitutes did not trouble Gary in any obvious way. He compartmentalized effortlessly, attending Sunday services in the morning and cruising the strip Sunday evening, praying for forgiveness and then committing the same sins again without apparent internal conflict. This ability to maintain separate realities within his own mind was perhaps his most dangerous quality, the psychological mechanism that would later allow him to kill dozens of women while maintaining the facade of ordinary life. He began hunting in earnest in 1982, though later investigation would suggest he may have killed earlier victims whose bodies were never found or never connected to the Green River series. The trigger for the escalation remains unclear. Perhaps the isolation following his second divorce removed the last restraint on impulses he had been managing imperfectly for years. Perhaps the proliferation of women working the Strip in the early 1980s provided opportunity that overwhelmed caution. Perhaps some internal threshold was crossed, some psychological boundary that once breached could not be re-established. Whatever the mechanism, by the summer of 1982, Gary Ridgway had transitioned from fantasy to action, from imagining violence to committing it. His method was simple and effective. He cruised Pacific Highway South in his pickup truck, a vehicle indistinguishable from thousands of others on the road. He looked for women who appeared young, vulnerable, alone. He would pull over, roll down the window, negotiate a price with the practiced ease of someone who had been soliciting prostitutes for years. The women saw a slight, soft-spoken man who did not trigger their internal alarms, who offered cash without haggling, who seemed harmless in a profession where genuine threat was common enough that they had developed instincts for distinguishing dangerous clients from merely unpleasant ones. Gary read as safe. He cultivated this impression carefully. He was polite, he smiled, he made small talk, and the women climbed into his truck voluntarily, sealing their own fates. He would drive them to secluded locations he had scouted previously, usually wooded areas near the Green River or up logging roads in the hills. He would initiate sex, and then during or immediately after he would attack. His preferred method was manual strangulation from behind, his arm encircling the victim's throat, applying pressure until consciousness fled, and then continuing until breathing stopped and the body went limp. He claimed later that he often returned to the dump sites days or weeks after the murders to have sex with the decomposing bodies, a necrophilic compulsion that added another layer of horror to crimes already almost incomprehensible in their cruelty. He disposed of bodies with the casual efficiency of someone taking out garbage. The Green River initially, until that became too risky with police presence intensifying. Then the forest dump sites, locations he knew from his childhood explorations and adult hunting and fishing expeditions. He scattered the bodies across a wide geographic area, making pattern recognition more difficult for investigators. He sometimes placed multiple bodies in the same general location, creating what would later be termed cluster sites. But he varied his approach enough that no single dump site was used repeatedly, in ways that would have focused investigation prematurely. Between murders, he went to work at Kenworth. He painted trucks. He ate lunch with co-workers in the break room. He went home to his house in Auburn and watched television, and maintained his lawn, and attended church on Sundays. He dated women, normal women who were not prostitutes, presenting himself as a single man seeking companionship, a potential husband for someone willing to overlook his limited prospects and awkward demeanor. He married for a third time in 1985, during the height of the killing, to a woman named Judith Mawson, who knew nothing of his activities and would remain ignorant for 16 years until his arrest finally revealed the man she had been living with. When detectives interviewed him in 1983 and again in 1984, Gary presented as guileless and cooperative. He answered questions without evasion. He volunteered information about his arrest for solicitation, acknowledging it as shameful, but not attempting to minimize or hide it. He agreed to take polygraph examinations. He provided alibis that his wife and co-workers confirmed. He seemed almost eager to help the investigation, as if assisting detectives with their inquiries was a form of civic duty rather than a dangerous game he was playing with men who wanted to put him on death row. The detectives who interviewed him found nothing to elevate him above the hundreds of other men they questioned. His name went into the database as a person of interest, but he was not prioritized. The profile from the FBI suggested someone more intelligent, more controlled, more capable of sophisticated deception. Ridgway came across as simple, almost childlike, a man of limited capacity who seemed incapable of the organization and forethought required to kill nearly 50 women without leaving significant evidence. The investigators were looking for a monster, and Gary Ridgway looked like a nobody, which was exactly the camouflage that allowed him to continue killing for another year before the murders finally stopped in late 1984. Why the killing ceased remained a mystery even to Ridgway himself when he later attempted to explain his actions. Perhaps the intense police presence on the Strip made victim acquisition too risky. Perhaps his marriage to Judith in 1985 provided some stabilizing influence, an outlet for his sexual compulsions that reduced the pressure that drove him to murder. Perhaps he had simply exhausted the readily available pool of victims who met his criteria. Or perhaps, as some psychologists later theorized, the compulsion that drove him had been temporarily satisfied, burned through in the frenzied 2-year period between 1982 and 1984. leaving him depleted and capable of restraint until such time as the need built again to unmanageable levels. Whatever the reason, the murders stopped, and Gary Ridgway continued his ordinary life. He worked at Kenworth for another 16 years. He and Judith bought a house together, a modest single story in Auburn where they lived quietly, taking occasional vacations, attending church, hosting Judith's children and grandchildren for holidays. Neighbors described them as a normal couple, perhaps a bit insular but pleasant enough when encountered at the mailbox or the grocery store. Judith later said she never suspected anything wrong. Gary was a good provider, faithful in his way, attentive if not particularly demonstrative. She knew about his religious faith, his regular church attendance, his stated desire to live a life pleasing to God. She knew he had been married before, that those relationships had failed, but she believed she had found in him a decent man who had made mistakes in the past and was trying to do better. She shared his bed for 16 years, never knowing that the man beside her had strangled dozens of women and hidden their bodies in the woods. And in those woods, the remains continued their slow dissolution, scattered across King County and beyond, some discovered within months, others lying undisturbed for years, a few never found at all. The investigation continued at reduced intensity through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, detectives following leads that went nowhere, families calling periodically to ask if there had been any progress. The answer always the same: no arrests. No significant breaks. The case remained open, but hope dimmed with each passing year. The Green River Killer had become a historical curiosity, a notorious unsolved case that criminology students studied and true crime enthusiasts debated, but that seemed destined to remain forever beyond resolution. Gary Ridgway read the news coverage occasionally, curious about what the police knew, whether they were getting closer. But mostly he did not think about the murders at all. They existed in some separate compartment of his mind, accessible when he chose to remember, but otherwise sealed away behind the ordinary concerns of daily life. He had work to do, bills to pay, a wife to keep satisfied, church services to attend. The women he had killed were gone, their bodies reduced to bone and scraps of cloth buried in the earth. And Gary Ridgway, the man who had murdered them, painted trucks and went home each evening to a quiet house where nothing suggested the enormity of what he had done or the justice that was slowly, invisibly, moving toward him through the patient advance of forensic science. Chapter 6. The Dump Sites. The forests south of Seattle had grown thick in the decades since the great logging operations had stripped the land bare. By the 1980s, second-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar rose 60 feet or more, their canopies interlocking to create a perpetual twilight at ground level, even on summer afternoons. Beneath the trees, the undergrowth was nearly impenetrable in places, walls of salal and Oregon grape and blackberry bramble that tore clothing and skin, that concealed whatever lay within their thorny embrace. These were not recreational forests. There were no marked trails, no campgrounds, no scenic overlooks. These were working landscapes, logged periodically by timber companies, crossed by utility right-of-ways and access roads that saw traffic once a month at most. And scattered through this green wilderness, hidden with varying degrees of care, lay the remains of women whose last moments had been terror and pain. The first cluster site was discovered in August of 1982, though investigators did not recognize it as such initially. The 4 bodies found on August 15th near the Green River appeared to be opportunistic dumping, the killer using the river as a convenient disposal method. But as more remains surfaced through the autumn and into 1983, a pattern emerged. The killer was not choosing dump locations randomly. He was selecting specific areas that met certain criteria. They were accessible by vehicle, usually via dirt roads or logging tracks that branched off paved highways. They were secluded enough that someone parking and walking into the woods would not be observed. They were topographically complex, with ravines and gullies and dense vegetation that made systematic searching nearly impossible. And critically, they were places the killer knew intimately, locations he had visited repeatedly over years, building a mental map that allowed him to navigate in darkness if necessary. Star Lake Road became a grim landmark in the investigation. The road ran through unincorporated King County southeast of Seattle, a narrow 2-lane that connected residential areas with commercial zones, passing through stretches of undeveloped forest land. In late 1982 and early 1983, searchers found multiple bodies in the woods adjacent to Star Lake Road, scattered across a half-mile stretch, some within yards of the roadway, others hundreds of feet back in the undergrowth. The victims had been left in various states of concealment. Some were covered with branches and debris, half-hearted attempts to hide what would inevitably be found. Others were simply laid on the ground and abandoned, left to the elements and the animals that would scatter the bones and accelerate decomposition. The task force established search protocols based on the emerging pattern. When a body was found, teams would conduct intensive grid searches of the surrounding area, walking parallel lines through the forest looking for additional remains. This method proved grimly effective. Finding one body often led to discovering 2 or 3 more within a few hundred yards. The killer was using these locations as long-term dump sites, returning multiple times over weeks or months, depositing bodies in areas he felt confident would not be searched or stumbled upon by civilians. Mountain View Cemetery became another cluster site, though the location was darkly ironic given its name. The cemetery served the community of Auburn, Gary Ridgway's hometown, though this connection would not be recognized for nearly 2 decades. Adjacent to the cemetery were undeveloped parcels of land, wooded hillsides too steep for construction, where blackberry brambles grew in impenetrable tangles and the ground was littered with deadfall from winter storms. In March of 1984, a man walking his dog off-leash found skeletal remains partially covered by leaves and branches. The subsequent search of the area revealed 3 more bodies in various stages of decomposition, all within a quarter mile of each other. The forensic analysis of the dump sites provided information about the killer's behavior and psychology. He was not panicking during disposal. He took time to carry or drag bodies away from roadways, suggesting confidence that he would not be interrupted. In several cases, the bodies showed evidence of having been arranged post-mortem, positioned in ways that seemed to have symbolic significance to the killer, though the meaning remained opaque to investigators. Some victims were left fully clothed, others were found nude or partially nude, their clothing discovered separately, sometimes yards away from the body, sometimes never located at all. The geographic distribution of dump sites was analysed by FBI specialists who created maps showing the locations of all known remains. The pattern that emerged was telling. The sites clustered in 2 main areas, the region immediately surrounding the Green River, and a broader zone stretching from Auburn south through Kent and into unincorporated areas near Enumclaw and the foothills of the Cascades. This geographic signature suggested the killer lived or worked in the southern King County area, that these were his familiar landscapes, places he knew from daily life rather than locations he had researched specifically for body disposal. Detectives drove the roads between dump sites, trying to understand the killer's route selection. Why had he chosen this particular logging road and not another half a mile away? What distinguished this ravine from dozens of others in the same forest? The answers were not immediately apparent, but the exercise built familiarity with the terrain, helped investigators develop an intuition for the kinds of places the killer preferred. When new remains were discovered, detectives could often predict where additional bodies might be hidden based on topography and vegetation, and accessibility patterns they had observed at previous sites. The search operations themselves were physically and emotionally exhausting. Teams of deputies and volunteers would gather at first light, receive assignments for specific grid coordinates, and then spend hours pushing through undergrowth, climbing over deadfall, sliding down muddy slopes, searching for the visual cues that indicated human remains. Bones were often scattered by animals, clothing decomposed into scraps of fabric that blended with leaf litter. Soft tissue that had not been consumed or weathered away often resembled other organic matter at casual glance. The searchers had to train their eyes to recognize the specific shapes and colors that indicated a body, rather than a deer carcass, or a discarded mannequin, or the countless pieces of garbage that people dumped illegally in the woods. The psychological toll of this work was substantial. Detectives and searchers were exposed repeatedly to death in its most undignified forms. The bodies they found were not peaceful or preserved. They were decomposed, violated by insects and animals and weather, reduced to bone and leathery tissue and hair. The smell of advanced decomposition was unforgettable, a sweet rotten odor that clung to clothing and seemed to penetrate sinuses and lungs that triggered nausea and made eating difficult for hours afterward. Some searchers developed coping mechanisms, dark humor or emotional detachment. Others simply broke, requesting reassignment after finding one body too many, unable to continue exposing themselves to the evidence of such sustained cruelty. The forensic anthropologists who analysed skeletal remains faced their own challenges. Many of the bodies had been exposed to the elements for months or years before discovery. Soft tissue was gone. Dental work, when present, became the primary means of identification, though this required having a missing person report with dental records to compare against. In cases where no such records existed, the remains might sit in the medical examiner's office indefinitely, Jane Doe followed by an alphanumeric designation, waiting for someone to file a report that would provide the information needed for positive identification. The clothing and personal effects found at dump sites were meticulously documented and preserved. A broken necklace, fragments of denim, a single shoe. These items became evidence, though their evidentiary value was limited. They confirmed identities when linked to descriptions in missing person reports. They sometimes provided information about the last time a victim had been seen. But they rarely pointed toward a suspect. The killer left no fingerprints on the clothing. No biological evidence that could be meaningfully analysed with the forensic techniques available in the early 1980s. He was careful, or lucky, or both, managing to kill and dispose of dozens of women without leaving the kind of trace evidence that would have enabled investigators to identify him through conventional means. By 1985, investigators had identified 18 separate dump sites across King County. Some contained single bodies, others held 3 or 4 or more. The total confirmed victim count had reached 48, with another dozen women still missing and presumed murdered, though their remains had not been located. The geographic area encompassing all the dump sites covered approximately 100 square miles of forest, residential neighbourhoods, industrial zones, and agricultural land. Searching this terrain systematically was impossible. The task force could only react to discoveries, investigating intensively when remains surfaced, then moving on to the next site when the initial search was exhausted. The dump sites also provided information about the timeline of killings. By analysing decomposition rates and insect colonisation patterns, forensic entomologists could estimate how long remains had been exposed to the environment. This data, combined with missing person reports, allowed investigators to construct rough timelines. The killing had begun in earnest in mid-1982. It had intensified through 1983 and into early 1984. Then, gradually, the pace had slowed. The last body conclusively linked to the Green River killer was found in late 1984. After that, no new victims appeared, though investigators remained uncertain whether the killing had truly stopped or whether bodies were simply hidden so well that they escaped detection. The forests held their secrets with patient indifference. Seasons turned. Rain fell and washed away traces. Wind scattered leaves over shallow graves. Trees grew taller, their roots penetrating the earth where bones lay buried. And hikers occasionally stumbled across remains, calling 911 in shock and horror, triggering yet another investigation, another identification, another notification to a family that had been hoping against hope that their missing daughter had simply run away to California or Oregon and would someday call home. Gary Ridgway knew these forests as well as anyone alive. He had hunted in them as a teenager. He had hiked their trails and fished their streams. He knew which logging roads were gated and which remained open year-round. He knew where the blackberry brambles grew thickest and which ravines were too steep for casual hikers to navigate. This intimate knowledge had allowed him to hide his victims with terrible efficiency, selecting locations where discovery would be delayed months or years, where evidence would degrade beyond forensic usefulness, where the very density of the forest itself became an accomplice in his crimes. And when he drove past these locations in subsequent years, going about his ordinary life, running errands or commuting to work, he would sometimes glance toward the tree line and remember what lay hidden just beyond sight. The memory did not trouble him. The dead women were not people in his mind. They were trash he had disposed of, a problem he had solved by transporting them away from his immediate environment and leaving them where they would cause him no further difficulty. That some had been found and identified was regrettable but inevitable. That others remained hidden gave him a sense of satisfaction, proof that his method had been sound, that he had managed the practical aspects of murder with competence and foresight. The trees grew and the rain fell and the bones lay scattered through the green shadows, silent testimony to crimes that had shocked a region and baffled investigators who had thrown everything they had at the case, only to watch it slowly go cold, unsolved. The killer vanished into the vast anonymity of American life, protected by ordinariness and the passage of time. The Chapter 7, The Long Silence. The years after 1984 carried a peculiar quality of suspended dread. The bodies had stopped appearing with regularity, but this brought no comfort to investigators who understood that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. The killer might be dead. He might be in prison for unrelated crimes. He might have moved to another jurisdiction and begun hunting there, his new victims attributed to different cases, different task forces, the connection never made. Or he might simply be dormant, the compulsion that drove him temporarily satisfied, waiting for conditions to align again in ways that would permit resumption of the killing. The task force operated in this state of uncertainty, maintaining the investigation at reduced intensity, following leads that continued trickling in, but lacking the urgency that had characterized the early years when fresh bodies appeared weekly and the hunt felt immediate and winnable. Detective Dave Reichert remained the public face of the investigation even as resources diminished and other detectives rotated off the case. By 1987, the task force had been reduced to a skeleton crew, a handful of investigators who worked the Green River murders alongside other cases, no longer fully dedicated to the serial killer hunt. Reichert himself was promoted to sergeant, then lieutenant, his career advancing even as the case that had defined it remained stubbornly unsolved. He gave occasional interviews to journalists writing retrospective pieces on the anniversary of the first discoveries. He appeared on television programs about unsolved mysteries, appealing one more time for information, offering reward money that had been pooled from various sources, maintaining hope that someone somewhere knew something that would finally break the case open. The families of the victims existed in a permanent state of incomplete mourning. Some had been able to bury their daughters, conducting funerals and memorial services, attempting to find closure in ritual even as the killer remained at large. Others still waited for remains to be identified, hoping that the phone would ring with news that would transform their missing daughters from uncertainly dead to definitively murdered, an exchange that might seem morbid to outsiders, but that felt necessary to families trapped in liminal space between hope and grief. And a few families had simply stopped calling the task force, exhausted by years of waiting, choosing to move forward with their lives while carrying the unresolved loss like a stone in their chest. The media attention that had been so intense in 1982 and 1983 faded as other stories captured public interest. The Green River Killer remained famous within the true crime community, discussed in books and magazine articles, analysed by amateur detectives who studied the case files and developed elaborate theories about the killer's identity. But for the general public, the case receded into history, one more unsolved mystery among many, tragic but ultimately just another story about bad things happening to vulnerable people in circumstances most citizens never had to contemplate. The investigation itself had produced an enormous archive of information. The case files filled multiple rooms, tens of thousands of pages of witness statements, tip sheets, surveillance logs, forensic reports, and miscellaneous documentation. Investigators had interviewed more than 18,000 people over the years. They had pursued leads in multiple states. They had consulted with experts in fields ranging from forensic entomology to geographic profiling to criminal psychology. And yet, despite this massive accumulation of data, they had failed to identify the killer with sufficient certainty to make an arrest. The answer was in there somewhere, investigators believed, buried in the mountains of paper, waiting to be recognized by someone with fresh eyes or a different analytical approach. Technology was advancing in ways that offered theoretical hope, even as practical application lagged behind. DNA analysis had emerged as a forensic tool in the mid-1980s, first used successfully in criminal cases in Britain, and then gradually adopted by American law enforcement. The technique required biological samples, blood or semen or saliva, and the ability to extract genetic material from those samples and create profiles that could be compared against each other or against databases of known offenders. The theory was elegant. Every human being possessed unique DNA, a genetic fingerprint that could identify them with near certainty if sufficient sample material was available. The Green River case had biological evidence. Semen samples had been collected from several victims during autopsy, preserved in the medical examiner's freezers, waiting for technology that could analyze them. The samples were degraded, the passage of time and the conditions of decomposition having damaged the genetic material, but they still existed, still held the theoretical possibility of revealing the killer's identity. The problem was that DNA analysis in the late 1980s and early 1990s was expensive, time-consuming, and required sample sizes and quality that the degraded evidence from the Green River victims often did not meet. The technology was improving, but slowly, and investigators could only wait and hope that future advances would eventually allow analysis of the evidence they had preserved. The task force also maintained a list of priority suspects, men who had been identified through the investigation and who remained persons of interest despite alibis or inconclusive polygraph results. Gary Ridgway's name appeared on this list, though not at the top. He had been interviewed multiple times in the 1980s, had provided biological samples for blood typing, had been polygraphed and cleared. But investigators had learned not to dismiss suspects completely. Polygraphs were unreliable. Alibis could be manufactured or mistaken. The killer was intelligent enough to deceive, patient enough to wait out the investigation. So names stayed in the database, files remained accessible, and detectives periodically revisited old suspects when new information or new technology suggested a fresh look might be warranted. Life in the Seattle area continued its evolution through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The city grew prosperous with the rise of Microsoft and Amazon, and Boeing's continued dominance in commercial aviation. The population expanded, real estate values climbed. The grunge music scene emerged from the city's underground clubs and briefly made Seattle the cultural center of alternative rock. And through all of this growth and change, the memory of the Green River Killer persisted as a dark undercurrent, a reminder that evil had walked these streets recently enough that many adults remembered it, that the families of 48 confirmed victims still lived in the area, still carried their grief, still waited for justice that seemed increasingly unlikely ever to arrive. The Strip itself changed character as the city grew wealthier. Property values along Pacific Highway South increased. Motels were demolished and replaced with commercial developments. The sex trade moved indoors or migrated to other areas where police presence was less intense. By the mid-1990s, the Sea-Tac Strip no longer resembled the landscape of 1982. The women who had worked those corners were dead or in prison, or had moved to other cities, or had somehow escaped the life and were trying to build something stable from the wreckage of their youth. The new generation of sex workers operated differently, using pagers and later cell phones to arrange encounters, working from apartments and hotels rather than street corners, adapting to law enforcement pressure and market conditions in ways that made them slightly less visible and perhaps marginally safer than their predecessors had been. Gary Ridgway continued his ordinary life through these years, working at Kenworth, living quietly in Auburn with his third wife Judith. He was in his 40s now, no longer young, his hair thinning, his body thickening in the way of men who do physical labor, but also consume too much beer and fried food. He had no criminal record beyond the single solicitation arrest from 1982. He paid his taxes, he maintained his home, he attended church with enough regularity to be recognized by other congregants, but not so constantly as to draw special attention. He was, in every visible respect, exactly the kind of working-class man who formed the backbone of American society, unremarkable and unthreatening, someone neighbors might borrow tools from or chat with at the grocery store but would never suspect of harboring monstrous secrets. He thought about the murders occasionally, though not obsessively. The compulsion that had driven him in the early 1980s had subsided, satisfied or redirected, or simply dormant. He still used prostitutes occasionally, encounters arranged through personal ads or chance meetings, but he no longer killed them. Whether this restraint was conscious choice, or simply the natural diminishment of whatever psychological fire had burned so intensely in his early 30s remained unclear even to Ridgway himself. He knew he had done terrible things. He knew the bodies were still out there, hidden in the forests he drove past regularly. But the knowledge did not burden him with guilt or fear. The women had been prostitutes. and in his moral calculus their deaths did not register as genuine loss. He had disposed of human garbage. And if society was troubled by this, well, society had created the conditions that made such women exist in the first place. The detectives who had worked the case in its active years were aging too, moving toward retirement, their lives shaped by the investigation even as it receded into the past. Dave Reichert had risen through the ranks, becoming a respected figure in King County law enforcement, known beyond the region as the detective who had led the Green River investigation even though he had not solved it. The failure troubled him more than he admitted publicly. He had devoted years to the hunt, sacrificed his marriage and his health and his relationship with his children, and he had nothing to show for it except an office full of boxes containing evidence that had not yielded the answer. He promised himself he would stay involved as long as necessary, that he would not retire until the case was resolved, that he owed the victims and their families at least that much persistence. In 1991, a documentary film crew began work on a project about the Green River murders. They interviewed families, talked with investigators, filmed the dump sites, and the former locations along the strip where victims had last been seen. The project took 2 years to complete. When it finally aired on public television, it reignited brief interest in the case. The task force received a surge of new tips, most worthless, a few interesting enough to warrant follow-up, but again, nothing broke. The investigation cycled through another round of activity, and then returned to its low-level hum, maintained but not emphasized. Open but not actively worked, the 1990s brought advances in DNA technology that finally made analysis of the preserved evidence feasible. In 1987, DNA profiling had been primitive, requiring large samples and producing results that were not always courtroom admissible. By the mid-1990s, the technique had been refined. Smaller samples could be analyzed, the profiles generated were more detailed, and critically, jurisdictions were beginning to establish DNA databases, collections of genetic profiles from convicted offenders that could be searched when crime scene evidence produced a profile of unknown origin. Washington State had established such a database, though it was small in the early years, containing profiles only from the most serious offenders and those convicted after the database's establishment. In 1997, the King County Sheriff's Office submitted evidence from the Green River case for DNA analysis using the improved technology now available. The degraded semen samples from several victims were sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. Forensic scientists worked carefully with the limited material, using techniques that had not existed when the evidence was first collected. And slowly, painstakingly, they succeeded in developing partial DNA profiles from 3 of the samples. The profiles were incomplete, missing some genetic markers, but they were substantial enough to be useful for comparison purposes. If a suspect could be identified and his DNA profile obtained, the crime scene evidence could potentially link him definitively to the murders. The task force now possessed what they had lacked for 15 years: genetic evidence that could identify the killer if they could only determine who to test. The problem remained identification. The DNA database in Washington contained fewer than 5,000 profiles in 1997. The Green River killer's DNA would only be in that database if he'd been convicted of a serious crime after the database's establishment and had been required to provide a sample. This seemed unlikely. A man who had killed 48 women and then stopped completely suggested someone with extraordinary self-control, someone unlikely to commit subsequent crimes that would lead to arrest and conviction and mandatory DNA sampling. But the existence of the DNA profiles changed the calculus of the investigation. Every suspect in the database, every man who'd been interviewed during the original investigation, and who could be located and asked to provide a voluntary sample, became a potential match. The task force began the laborious process of tracking down old suspects, explaining the new technology, requesting cooperation. Most men agreed to provide samples, eager to clear their names definitively after living under suspicion for years. The samples were analyzed, comparisons were made, and one by one suspects were eliminated, their genetic profiles failing to match the evidence from the crime scenes. Gary Ridgway remained employed at Kenworth through the 1990s. He had worked there for nearly 3 decades by the late 1990s, a fixture in the paint department, known to younger employees as Gary, or sometimes as the old guy who had been there forever. He was reliable, if not ambitious. He showed up on time, he did his work, he went home. In 1998, investigators working cold cases began reviewing the old Green River files, looking for suspects who might be good candidates for DNA comparison. Ridgway's name came up during this review. He had been interviewed multiple times in the 1980s. He had a solicitation arrest from 1982. He matched the general profile, and critically, he had provided biological samples in the 1980s that were still in evidence storage, preserved for nearly 2 decades, waiting. In 1998, investigators submitted Gary Ridgway's old blood sample for DNA analysis and comparison against the crime scene evidence. The analysis took months. The forensic laboratory was backlogged with cases. The Green River murders were old news, low priority compared to recent rapes and homicides that demanded immediate attention. The samples sat in queues, waiting for technician time, for equipment availability, for the slow grinding of bureaucratic process. And Gary Ridgway continued painting trucks, unaware that genetic evidence he had provided voluntarily 15 years earlier was slowly being processed through laboratories that would ultimately reveal what decades of investigation had failed to discover: that the quiet man from Auburn, the church-going truck painter with the unremarkable face, was the most prolific serial killer in American history. Chapter 8: DNA and Patience. The science of genetic fingerprinting had evolved from theoretical possibility to practical reality in the span of less than 2 decades. In 1984, British geneticist Alec Jeffreys had discovered that certain regions of human DNA contained patterns unique to each individual, patterns that could be visualized and compared through laboratory techniques involving restriction enzymes and radioactive probes. The implications for forensic science were immediately apparent. Here was a method of identification more certain than fingerprints, more reliable than blood typing, capable of linking suspects to crime scenes with odds of error so astronomical they approached impossibility. But the early techniques were cumbersome, required fresh samples in substantial quantities, and produced results that took weeks or months to generate. Through the late 1980s and 1990s, the methodology improved steadily. Polymerase chain reaction technology allowed amplification of tiny DNA samples, making analysis possible from traces of biological material that previous methods could not have processed. The markers used for comparison became more sophisticated, generating profiles with greater discriminatory power, and the time required for analysis decreased from months to weeks to days. By 1998, DNA profiling had become standard practice in major criminal investigations, though backlogs plagued crime laboratories across the country as demand far exceeded capacity. The Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory in Seattle processed samples from cases throughout the state, prioritizing recent violent crimes over cold cases unless special circumstances warranted elevation. The Green River murders qualified as special circumstances. The case had consumed enormous resources over 16 years. It remained unsolved despite the largest investigation in state history. And now, finally, technology existed that might provide the answer that traditional detective work had failed to produce. When the task force submitted Gary Ridgway's preserved blood sample for comparison against crime scene evidence, the request carried weight. This was not routine analysis. This was potentially the resolution of a case that had haunted the region for nearly 2 decades. The forensic scientists who received the samples understood the significance of their work. They handled the evidence with meticulous care, following protocols designed to prevent contamination and ensure chain of custody would survive courtroom scrutiny if the analysis produced a match. The crime scene evidence consisted of semen samples collected during autopsies of 3 victims: Marsha Chapman, Opal Mills, and Carol Christensen. The samples had been frozen since the early 1980s, stored at temperatures that slowed but did not prevent degradation of the genetic material. Freezing preserved DNA better than room temperature storage, but nothing stopped the slow chemical breakdown that occurred over years. The forensic team would be working with compromised samples, genetic material that had been damaged by time and by the decomposition that had occurred before the bodies were even recovered. Success was not guaranteed. The process began with extraction, carefully removing DNA from the biological samples using chemical treatments that separated genetic material from cellular debris and contaminants. The extracted DNA was then quantified to determine how much usable material was present. the crime scene samples yielded small amounts, nanograms rather than micrograms, barely sufficient for analysis using the techniques available in 1998. The forensic scientists proceeded to amplification using polymerase chain reaction, a process that made millions of copies of specific DNA regions, generating enough material to analyze even from the degraded starting samples. The amplified DNA was then processed through genetic analyzers that read the specific markers used for human identification, generating profiles that could be compared. Gary Ridgway's reference sample from 1987 was in better condition, having been properly stored as whole blood rather than as biological material recovered from decomposing remains. The DNA extraction from his sample proceeded smoothly, yielding high-quality genetic material that produced a complete profile showing all the markers the forensic laboratory examined. This profile became the standard against which the crime scene evidence would be compared. If the DNA from the semen samples matched Ridgway's profile at all tested markers, the conclusion would be essentially certain. Gary Ridgway had left his genetic signature inside 3 women who had been murdered in 1982, women he had claimed never to have met, women whose deaths he had expressed sympathy about during police interviews 16 years earlier. The analysis consumed months. The forensic scientist worked carefully, repeating tests to confirm results, running controls to ensure the equipment was functioning properly, documenting every step in laboratory notebooks that would eventually be submitted as evidence if the case went to trial. By early 2001, the results were conclusive. The DNA profile from the crime scene evidence matched Gary Leon Ridgway at every tested marker. The statistical probability of this match occurring by chance was calculated at 1 in several billion. For practical purposes, the odds approached impossibility. Gary Ridgway had been sexually intimate with at least 3 of the Green River victims at or near the time of their deaths. He had lied repeatedly to investigators, and the genetic evidence now proved beyond any reasonable doubt that he was the killer the task force had been hunting for 19 years. The news reached Detective Dave Reichert on a grey morning in March 2001. He was now Sheriff of King County, having been elected to the position in 1997, but he had maintained involvement in the Green River investigation, even as his administrative duties expanded. When the crime lab director called to report the DNA results, Reichert sat in his office listening to the technical explanation, feeling an emotion he could not immediately name. Relief, vindication, a bone-deep exhaustion finally lifting. Rage that this man had been in their grasp in 1983 and 1984 and they had missed him, let him walk away, let him continue his life while the families of his victims had waited nearly 2 decades for justice. The call lasted 15 minutes. When it ended, Reichert sat in silence, staring at the wall where photographs of victims still hung. Faces he had carried with him for 19 years, women whose names he could recite from memory, whose families he had looked in the eye over and over with nothing to offer except promises that the investigation continued. The legal challenge now was building a case strong enough to withstand scrutiny at trial. The DNA evidence was powerful, but it was not unlimited. Only 3 victims had yielded usable genetic material. Gary Ridgway was suspected of killing at least 48 women, possibly more, but the evidence linked him conclusively to only 3 murders. Prosecutors needed more. They needed witnesses who could place Ridgway with other victims. They needed evidence from his home or vehicles. They needed his own words, a confession if possible, though experienced investigators knew that suspects rarely confessed unless they believed cooperation might benefit them. The task force began preparing for arrest while simultaneously building the broader case, gathering every scrap of evidence accumulated over 19 years, reviewing thousands of pages of interview transcripts, identifying witnesses who were still alive and locatable. Surveillance of Gary Ridgway began in September 2001. Detectives followed him from his home in Auburn to the Kenworth plant where he still worked, now 52 years old, still painting trucks, still living the ordinary life that had camouflaged him for 2 decades. They watched him eat lunch alone in his pickup truck, reading the newspaper, drinking coffee from a thermos. They watched him stop at grocery stores on his way home, buying the mundane supplies of daily existence. They watched him attend church services sitting in the back pews, singing hymns in his off-key voice, apparently unremarkable among the other congregants seeking salvation or community, or simple routine on Sunday mornings. And they waited for the prosecutors to finish preparing the case, to assemble the evidence and legal arguments that would ensure Gary Ridgway spent the rest of his life in prison if they could not secure a death penalty. The decision was made to arrest on November 30th, 2001. The timing was strategic. Prosecutors wanted to file charges before the end of the year, maintaining momentum and preventing any technical issues with statute of limitations, though murder carried no such limitations in Washington. The arrest would occur at Ridgway's workplace during his shift, ensuring he was away from his home and could be taken into custody without incident, without time to destroy evidence, without opportunity to harm himself or others. The task force planned the operation carefully. Plainclothes detectives would approach Ridgway in the Kenworth parking lot as he arrived for work. Uniformed officers would provide backup. A search warrant for his home would be executed simultaneously, and the media would be notified after the arrest was complete, triggering the press coverage that would finally announce to a region that had waited 19 years that the Green River Killer had been caught. November the 30th dawned cold and overcast, typical Seattle weather entering winter. Gary Ridgway left his house in Auburn at the usual hour, driving his pickup truck along the familiar route to the Kenworth plant in Renton. He parked in the employee lot where he had parked thousands of times before. He gathered his lunch cooler and thermos and walked toward the plant entrance, moving with the slow deliberation of a man in his 50s whose body had been used hard by decades of physical labor. And then detectives stepped from their vehicles and approached him, badges displayed, voices calm but commanding. Gary Leon Ridgway, you are under arrest for the murders of Marsha Chapman, Opal Mills, Carol Christensen, and Cynthia Hines. You have the right to remain silent. Ridgway did not resist. He did not seem surprised. He stood quietly while handcuffs were applied, his face expressing nothing, no fear or anger or resignation, just a kind of blank acceptance that might have been shock, or might have been the face he had worn beneath the mask of normality for 20 years, finally exposed. The detectives led him to a vehicle and drove him to the King County Jail, while other officers executed the search warrant at his home, going through closets and drawers and garage shelves, looking for souvenirs or clothing or weapons or documents, anything that might link him to additional victims or provide insight into how he had managed to kill so many women without being caught. The search of Ridgway's home yielded less than investigators hoped. The house was neat, unremarkable, filled with the ordinary possessions of a working-class couple. There were photographs on the walls showing Gary and Judith on vacation, at family gatherings smiling for the camera. There was religious literature, Bibles and devotional booklets, evidence of the faith Gary had professed for decades. There were tools in the garage and fishing equipment and a workbench, but there were no trophies from victims, no photographs or jewelry or identification, no diary documenting murders, no maps marking dump sites. If Gary Ridgway had kept physical reminders of his crimes, he had disposed of them long ago, or he had hidden them in locations the search teams could not find. The house gave up its residents' secrets reluctantly, revealing only that he had lived there for 16 years, maintaining a facade so complete that even the woman who shared his bed had no idea what he had done. Judith Ridgway was at work when the search team arrived. Officers contacted her and requested she come home. When she arrived and was told why her house was being searched, she collapsed. The woman who had been married to Gary Ridgway since 1985, who had built a life with him, who had believed him to be a decent if unremarkable man, learned in a single terrible conversation that she had been sleeping beside the most prolific serial killer in American history. Her shock was genuine and complete. Detectives interviewed her extensively in the following days, but she had nothing to offer. She had not known. She had not suspected. She had noticed nothing unusual in Gary's behavior, no absences she could not account for, no suspicious activities, no hints that the man she called her husband had murdered dozens of women before they even met. The arrest was announced at a press conference that afternoon. Sheriff Reichert stood before cameras and microphones, flanked by prosecutors and FBI agents, and told the assembled media that DNA evidence had linked Gary Leon Ridgway to 4 Green River murders and that he was suspected in dozens more. The news spread instantly. Local television stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news bulletins. National networks picked up the story within hours. The Green River Killer had been caught. After 19 years, after one of the longest and most expensive investigations in American history, a 52-year-old truck painter from Auburn was in custody, charged with murders that had terrorized the Seattle area through the early 1980s. The families of victims received notification before the press conference, calls from detectives who had maintained contact with them over the years, informing them that an arrest had been made, that the man accused of killing their daughters and sisters was in jail. The reactions varied. Some families felt relief, gratitude that the waiting had finally ended. Others felt anger that it had taken so long, that the killer had lived free for nearly 2 decades while they had grieved. A few felt nothing at all, the news arriving too late to matter. The daughter they had lost decades earlier, and the pain had long since calcified into something that could not be eased by justice delayed so long it felt almost meaningless. Gary Ridgway sat in the King County Jail, processed through booking, fingerprinted and photographed and stripped of the identity he had maintained for 52 years. He was no longer a free man. He was an inmate, housed in isolation for his own protection, monitored constantly by guards who understood that suspects in high-profile cases sometimes attempted suicide or were targeted by other inmates seeking notoriety. He requested an attorney. He declined to make any statement, and he waited, held without bail, facing 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, knowing that Washington state permitted capital punishment and that the prosecution would almost certainly seek his execution. The investigation that had seemed finished suddenly reopened in a new form. Now detectives had a suspect. They could work backward, connecting evidence to Ridgway specifically rather than to an unknown offender. They could show his photograph to witnesses who had seen suspicious vehicles near dump sites. They could analyze his work schedules and vehicle registrations and geographic movements over the relevant years, building a timeline that would demonstrate he had opportunity to commit all the murders. They could re-interview people who had known him, co-workers and neighbors and church members, asking new questions informed by knowledge of his guilt. And they could bring pressure on Ridgway himself, using the DNA evidence and the certainty of conviction to encourage cooperation, to persuade him that his only hope of avoiding execution was to tell them everything, to confess to all the murders, to provide details that would allow them to recover remains still hidden in the forest and give families the closure that came from knowing where their daughters lay. The machinery of justice began grinding forward. Prosecutors prepared for trial. Defense attorneys began building a case they knew was nearly impossible to win given the DNA evidence, but that they were ethically obligated to present. And Gary Ridgway, the invisible man who had killed his way through the early 1980s and then vanished back into ordinary life, sat in his cell and contemplated the fact that the secret he had carried for 2 decades was finally known, that the mask he had worn so successfully for so long had been stripped away by science he could not understand and persistence he had underestimated. The long silence had ended. The reckoning had begun. Chapter 9. The Arrest. The King County Jail had processed thousands of suspects through its booking system over the decades, petty criminals and violent offenders, the drunk and disorderly and the genuinely dangerous. The guards who worked there had seen every variation of human response to arrest. Some suspects were belligerent, threatening lawsuits and violence. Others were resigned, men who had been through the system so many times that booking was merely routine. A few broke down completely, weeping or raging or retreating into catatonic silence. Gary Ridgway fit none of these categories. He was cooperative but blank, answering questions when asked, following instructions without resistance, displaying no emotion that the intake officers could detect. He seemed almost detached from the proceedings, as if the arrest was happening to someone else, and he was merely observing from a comfortable distance. The initial booking procedures consumed several hours. Ridgway was photographed from multiple angles, the images capturing his unremarkable features for the official record. His fingerprints were taken electronically, rolled across a scanner that recorded the whorls and ridges that identified him uniquely. He was searched thoroughly, his clothing and personal effects inventoried and stored. He changed into the standard-issue jail uniform, orange jumpsuit and slip-on shoes, the costume that marked him as property of the justice system. Medical staff examined him briefly, checking vital signs, asking about medications or health conditions that might require monitoring. And then he was led to a cell in the isolation wing, a concrete box with a metal bunk and a stainless steel toilet, and a narrow window that looked out at nothing. The door closed with the heavy finality of industrial locks engaging. Gary Ridgway was alone with his thoughts, For the first time since his arrest, the news of the arrest spread through the Seattle area with the speed that only shocking revelations achieve. Co-workers at the Kenworth plant gathered in clusters, talking in hushed voices about the man who had painted trucks beside them for 30 years. He had seemed so normal, they said. Quiet, kept to himself, but never gave any indication he was capable of violence. Some remembered that Gary talked about prostitutes occasionally, complained about them, but that was not unusual among men who worked blue-collar jobs and held conservative religious views. Prostitution offended their sense of morality. That Gary had spoken against such women was unremarkable. That he had been systematically murdering them for years was incomprehensible. Neighbors in the Auburn community where Ridgway had lived since the mid-1980s expressed similar shock. The house on South 348th Street was modest, well-maintained, indistinguishable from dozens of others on the block. Gary had mowed his lawn regularly, taken out his trash on schedule, waved when passing on the sidewalk. He and Judith had seemed like any other middle-aged couple, neither especially friendly nor especially reclusive, just ordinary people living ordinary lives. That this man had killed at least 4 women and probably dozens more. That he had hidden bodies in forests while maintaining a facade of suburban normalcy, violated every assumption about how monsters were supposed to appear and behave. The church community that had embraced Gary Ridgway for nearly 2 decades struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the crimes he was accused of committing. He had attended services regularly. He had participated in Bible studies. He had offered testimony during revival meetings, speaking about his struggles with sin and his gratitude for God's forgiveness. Some congregants defended him initially, suggesting the arrest was a mistake, that the gentleman who sang hymns could not possibly be the Green River Killer. Others felt betrayed, recognizing that they had welcomed a murderer into their fellowship, had prayed beside him, had accepted his professions of faith while he carried the weight of dozens of deaths. The pastor who had known Gary for years issued a statement expressing shock and offering prayers for the victims' families, carefully avoiding any judgment about Ridgway's guilt or innocence. Judith Ridgway faced an impossible situation. Her husband of 16 years had been arrested for murders that had occurred before they met, crimes he had concealed from her completely. She was questioned extensively by detectives who needed to understand what she might have known or suspected, what Gary's behavior had been like during their marriage, whether there had been any indication of the violence he had committed decades earlier. Judith had nothing to offer. Gary had been a stable, if unexciting, husband. He went to work. He came home. They watched television together. They took occasional vacations. He had been sexually demanding in ways that sometimes made her uncomfortable, but nothing that suggested homicidal tendencies. She had believed him to be faithful. She had trusted him, and now she learned that the man she had shared a bed with for 16 years was accused of being one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. She filed for divorce within weeks of the arrest, unable to contemplate remaining married to someone accused of such crimes, regardless of her feelings or their shared history. The marriage dissolved quietly, paperwork processed through the courts while Gary sat in jail awaiting trial. Judith moved out of the house they had shared, unable to remain in a space that had become contaminated by association with horror. She changed her name back to her previous married name, attempting to distance herself from the Ridgway identity that would forever be associated with the murders. And she tried to rebuild a life from the wreckage of discovering that everything she had believed about her husband was fiction. The prosecution team began assembling the case that would be presented at trial. The DNA evidence was powerful but limited to 4 victims. To secure a death penalty, prosecutors needed to prove multiple aggravating factors, special circumstances that elevated these murders beyond even the terrible baseline of homicide. Premeditation was clear. The systematic nature of the killings demonstrated planning and forethought. The vulnerable victim status was also evident. The women had been engaged in prostitution, a high-risk activity that made them targets for predators. The disposal of bodies in multiple locations showed sophistication and effort to avoid detection. But the prosecution wanted more. They wanted Gary Ridgway to confess, to provide details that would allow them to charge him with additional murders, to create a narrative so overwhelming that no jury could question his guilt or hesitate to impose the ultimate penalty. The defense team faced an almost impossible task. The DNA evidence was essentially irrefutable. Gary Ridgway's genetic material had been found inside 3 murdered women. No alternate explanation could account for this fact in ways that would preserve his innocence. The defense could challenge the chain of custody, argue that the samples had been contaminated or mislabeled, but such arguments were weak when confronted with the meticulous documentation the crime lab had maintained. They could challenge the statistical interpretation, argue that the probability calculations were flawed, but expert witnesses would testify that the match was as certain as science could make anything. The reality was that Gary Ridgway would be convicted unless the defense could negotiate a plea agreement that spared his life in exchange for cooperation. Plea negotiations began in early 2002, months before the scheduled trial date. The prosecution's position was straightforward. They would seek the death penalty if the case went to trial. They were confident of conviction on the 4 charged murders and believed they could prove several more if necessary. But they were willing to consider a different outcome if Gary Ridgway would provide information that solved all the Green River murders, that allowed recovery of remaining victims, that gave families the closure that came from knowing definitively what had happened to their daughters. If Ridgway would confess to everything, provide details that could be verified, lead investigators to dump sites they had not found, the prosecution would recommend life imprisonment without possibility of parole rather than death. He would never be free, but he would live. The decision rested with Gary Ridgway and his attorneys. He was 52 years old. A death sentence meant years of appeals, uncertainty, the possibility of execution, but also the possibility that his sentence would be commuted, or that he would die of natural causes before the state killed him. Life without parole meant certainty. He would spend his remaining years in prison, but he would not face execution. He would have routine, predictability, the strange comfort that came from knowing exactly how the rest of his life would unfold. And he would have the opportunity to talk, to explain himself, to occupy the center of attention one final time before being locked away permanently. The negotiations consumed months. Prosecutors wanted verification that Ridgway's confessions were genuine. They needed details only the killer would know, information about victims and dump sites that had never been made public. Ridgway's attorneys facilitated carefully controlled interviews where Gary provided information incrementally, demonstrating knowledge while his lawyers ensured the interviews were recorded and preserved for the eventual plea agreement. And slowly, horribly, the true scope of Gary Ridgway's crimes emerged. He had not killed 4 women or 10 or 20. He had killed at least 48, possibly more, the exact number uncertain even in his own memory because the victims had blurred together. Individual women reduced to abstractions he had difficulty distinguishing decades later. The interviews revealed a man whose psychology was both banal and monstrous. Ridgway had killed prostitutes because he hated them, though his hatred was not hot rage but cold contempt. They were less than human in his mind, objects that existed to be used and discarded. He had selected them deliberately because he understood that society valued them less than other women, that their disappearances would generate minimal investigation, that their deaths would not mobilize the kind of resources that missing college students or nurses would command. He had been correct in this assessment. The Green River investigation had eventually become enormous, but only after the body count had reached levels that could not be ignored. Had he limited himself to killing 1 or 2 women a year, spacing the murders across a wider geographic area, he might have continued indefinitely without triggering the task force that eventually caught him. His method had been consistent. He cruised the strip looking for women who appeared young and vulnerable. He negotiated prices without haggling, presenting himself as just another John. He took the women to secluded locations where he killed them during or immediately after sex, strangling them manually, sometimes continuing sexual activity after death. He disposed of bodies quickly, usually within hours, using locations he knew from years of exploring the forests south of Seattle. He sometimes returned to dump sites to have sex with decomposing remains. A compulsion he described without apparent shame or recognition, that this detail elevated his crimes beyond even the terrible baseline of serial murder. And then he went back to his ordinary life, to his job and his home and his church, the compartmentalization complete. The families of victims were informed about the plea negotiations and given opportunity to express their views. The responses varied predictably. Some families wanted Gary Ridgway executed. He had killed their daughters and deserved the ultimate punishment, justice demanded his death. Other families wanted answers more than vengeance. They wanted to know where their daughters were buried. They wanted the details that would allow them to finally mourn properly. They wanted the truth more than they wanted blood. The prosecution weighed these competing desires while recognizing that a trial carried risks. Juries could surprise. A single holdout could prevent a death sentence. Better to secure guilty pleas to 48 murders and guarantee that Ridgway would die in prison than to risk a trial outcome that might be less than certain. In June 2003, nearly 2 years after his arrest, Gary Ridgway stood before Judge Richard Jones in King County Superior Court and formally entered guilty pleas to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The number 48 represented only the victims whose remains had been found, and whose deaths could be proven through forensic evidence or Ridgway's detailed confessions. There were other women he might have killed. Additional victims whose bodies were never recovered, or whose deaths he could not remember clearly enough to describe. But 48 was the count that could be proven beyond reasonable doubt, and 48 was the number to which he pleaded guilty in exchange for life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing consumed days. Families were given opportunity to address the court, to speak directly to Gary Ridgway about what his crimes had cost them. They stood one after another, some composed, others weeping, all of them describing loss that could never be repaired. They talked about daughters who would never have children of their own, about grandchildren who would never exist, about decades stolen not just from the victims but from everyone who loved them. They talked about Christmases and birthdays celebrated with empty chairs at the table, about graduations and weddings that never occurred, about all the ordinary milestones of life that had been prevented by a man who sat impassively in the courtroom showing no emotion. Gary Ridgway was given opportunity to speak. He stood and read from a prepared statement, his voice flat, his delivery suggesting someone reading a grocery list, rather than addressing the families of people he had murdered. He said he was sorry. He said he had accepted Jesus Christ and had been forgiven by God. He said he understood that the families were angry and that they had every right to be. But his apology carried no weight. The words were empty, ritualistic, spoken because his attorneys had advised him to express remorse, but containing no genuine emotion or understanding of the enormity of what he had done. Judge Jones pronounced sentence on December 18, 2003. 48 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Gary Leon Ridgway would spend the remainder of his natural life in the custody of the Washington State Department of Corrections. He would never be free. He would never experience another day outside of prison walls. He was 54 years old when sentenced. If he lived to average life expectancy, he would spend another 25 years or more behind bars, aging and dying in confinement, his name forever associated with one of the worst crime sprees in American history. The courtroom emptied slowly after sentencing. Families embraced each other and the detectives who had worked their daughters' cases for 2 decades. Some felt relief that the ordeal was finally over. Others felt only exhaustion. A few felt nothing, the sentencing unable to generate emotion when the loss they had suffered was already complete. And Gary Ridgway was led from the courtroom in shackles, transported to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he would begin serving his sentence, disappearing finally into the anonymity of the prison system, just another aging inmate among thousands, his face no longer recognized, his crimes fading into history. Chapter 10. Confessions in the Dark. The interview rooms in the King County Jail were designed for function rather than comfort. Concrete walls painted institutional beige. A metal table bolted to the floor, chairs that could not be used as weapons, fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical persistence, casting flat illumination that eliminated shadows and made everyone look tired and slightly unwell. In these rooms through the spring and summer of 2003, Gary Ridgway sat across from detectives and prosecutors and described in methodical detail how he had killed at least 48 women over a period spanning nearly 2 decades. The interviews were recorded on video, permanent documentation of confessions that would be played in court and studied by psychologists and criminologists for years afterward. Ridgway appeared on camera as he had appeared in life, unremarkable and slightly diminished, a man in his 50s whose body showed the wear of physical labor, whose face was ordinary to the point of blandness, whose voice carried no particular menace or charm. He wore jail-issue orange. His hands were often folded on the table before him. He spoke in a flat effect, describing murders the way someone might describe changing a tire or preparing a meal, detailing the mechanics without emotional investment, reporting facts without apparent recognition that the facts described systematic destruction of human life. The detectives who conducted the interviews had prepared for months. They knew the case files intimately. They had studied the dump sites, reviewed autopsy reports, memorized victim names and disappearance dates. Their job was to extract information while verifying that Ridgway's confessions were genuine, that he was not simply claiming responsibility for unsolved murders to secure his plea agreement. So they asked questions whose answers were not in the public record. Where exactly had he left the body of Wendy Caulfield? What had the victim been wearing? What jewellery had she been carrying? Did he remember the location of other remains that had not been found? The details that followed demonstrated conclusively that Ridgway was describing crimes he had actually committed, knowledge that could only have come from direct participation. He described his earliest murders with greater clarity than the later ones, the victims from 1982 and early 1983 remaining distinct in his memory, while those from late 1983 and 1984 had blurred together into a sequence he could not always arrange chronologically. He remembered Wendy Caulfield because she had been first or nearly first, a girl he had picked up near the Strip and strangled in his truck before dumping her body in the Green River. He had been nervous that first time, uncertain whether he could actually commit murder, but the act had been easier than he expected. She had not struggled long. Strangling someone into unconsciousness took less than a minute if done correctly, and after she was dead, she was just a body, a problem to be disposed of, no different than trash that needed removing from his vehicle. The pattern had been established then and repeated with minor variations across dozens of subsequent victims. He cruised Pacific Highway South looking for young women working the street. He negotiated prices, usually $20, sometimes more if the woman was particularly attractive, or if he sensed she was desperate and would accept work without careful screening. He drove them to locations he had identified previously, places where privacy was guaranteed and discovery unlikely. Sometimes these were wooded areas near the Green River in the early months. Later, after police presence near the river intensified, he used logging roads in the Cascade foothills, places he knew from childhood explorations and adult hunting trips. He killed them during or after sex, manual strangulation from behind, applying pressure until breathing stopped and the body went limp, and then he disposed of them, carrying or dragging bodies into the undergrowth, sometimes covering them with branches, sometimes simply leaving them exposed to elements and animals. He described returning to dump sites repeatedly, sometimes days after the initial disposal, sometimes weeks. He would have sex with the decomposing bodies, an activity he engaged in with multiple victims, treating the corpses as objects for his use, showing no revulsion or hesitation. The detectives listening to these confessions maintained professional composure, but the details were almost unbearable. This was necrophilia committed not once in passion or madness, but repeatedly, methodically, as if the bodies of murdered women were resources to be exploited until decomposition made further use impossible. Ridgway described this behavior without shame or apparent understanding that it represented a level of depravity that exceeded even the baseline horror of serial murder. The detectives asked why. Why had he killed these women? What had driven him to murder on such a scale? Ridgway's explanations were banal and circular. He hated prostitutes. He thought they were immoral. He believed they deserved to die. But when pressed about the origins of this hatred, he could offer only fragments. His mother had been controlling and critical. His second wife had discovered his use of prostitutes and divorced him. He felt that women in general had power over him sexually, and prostitutes represented the most obvious form of that power. Women who commodified the thing he craved compulsively. Killing them was a way of asserting control, of transforming the power dynamic from one where he was supplicant to one where he was absolutely dominant. They had something he wanted. He took it, and then he destroyed them. The psychology revealed in these interviews was simultaneously complex and simple. Complex in the ways that early trauma and personality disorders and sexual compulsion had combined to create a killer. Simple in that the underlying mechanism was rage at women expressed through violence against the most vulnerable women available. Ridgway was not sophisticated in his thinking. He had limited education and below-average intelligence. His reasoning was crude, but his instincts about victim selection had been sound. He had chosen women whose deaths would generate minimal investigation, whose lives society had already devalued. And he had been largely correct in this calculation for nearly 2 years, before the scale of killing forced the creation of a task force that eventually caught him through persistence and technological advance, rather than brilliant detective work. The detectives asked about specific victims, showing photographs, reading names. Some Ridgway remembered with surprising clarity. He described their physical appearance, what they had been wearing, details of conversation in his truck before he killed them. Others he could not recall at all. The woman in the photograph was unfamiliar. He might have killed her. The dates aligned with his activity. The dump site was one he had used, but he could not remember her face or voice or anything that distinguished her from the dozens of other women he had murdered during the same period. This inability to remember disturbed the detectives in ways that direct descriptions of violence did not. That Gary Ridgway had killed so many women that individual victims blurred into indistinguishable mass suggested a level of depersonalization that made him genuinely inhuman in some fundamental respect. He led investigators to dump sites that had not been found during the original investigation. In exchange for the plea agreement, Ridgway had agreed to cooperate in recovering remains of additional victims, giving families closure that came from knowing where their daughters were buried. So on multiple occasions through 2003, detectives transported Ridgway from jail to forested areas south of Seattle, walking him through undergrowth while he tried to remember where he had left bodies 2 decades earlier. The landscape had changed. Trees had grown, roads had been improved or abandoned, landmarks he remembered had disappeared. But occasionally his memory proved accurate. He would stop in a particular location, point toward a ravine or a cluster of trees, and searchers would find skeletal remains exactly where he indicated, confirming that his confessions were genuine and that the plea agreement was producing results the prosecution valued. The families who attended portions of the confession interviews witnessed something almost incomprehensible. Gary Ridgway sat calmly describing how he had murdered their daughters, speaking in matter-of-fact tones about strangling and disposal and post-mortem sexual activity, showing no emotion beyond occasional frustration when he could not remember details the detectives wanted. Some families had imagined this moment for 20 years, had fantasized about confronting their daughter's killer, about making him understand the magnitude of what he had taken from them. But confronting Ridgway generated no satisfaction. He was not dramatic or defiant. He was not remorseful in any meaningful sense. He was simply blank, a man reporting information without emotional investment, incapable of empathy or genuine human connection. Hating him felt pointless. He was already less than human, reduced by his own crimes to something that existed but did not truly live. The confession process consumed months, the interviews stretching across spring and summer of 2003, as prosecutors verified details and built the comprehensive case that would support the 48 guilty pleas Ridgway would eventually enter. The video recordings documented hundreds of hours of conversation, Gary Ridgway's voice describing murder after murder in the flat effect of someone reporting weather conditions or reading assembly instructions. Future researchers would analyze these recordings, looking for insights into the psychology of serial killers, trying to understand how an apparently ordinary man could commit such sustained violence. But the recordings would likely provide few answers beyond the obvious. Gary Ridgway killed because he wanted to, and because he could. The compulsion that drove him was not complex or mysterious. It was simply unrestrained rage given form through violence against women he had dehumanized completely. The plea agreement required Ridgway to plead guilty to all 48 murders the prosecution could prove, accepting responsibility for crimes spanning from 1982 to 1984 and possibly beyond. In exchange, he would receive life imprisonment without possibility of parole rather than death. The families who opposed this agreement argued that he deserved execution, that justice demanded his death. But prosecutors explained the practical realities. Death penalty cases consumed years in appeals. Ridgway might die of natural causes before the state executed him. And there was always risk, however small, that appeals courts would overturn the sentence on technical grounds, forcing retrials and prolonging the agony for families. Life without parole was certain. Ridgway would never be free. He would die in prison, and in exchange, families would receive answers they had waited decades to hear. The sentencing hearing in December 2003 brought together families from across the region, people who had lost daughters and sisters 2 decades earlier, who had lived with uncertainty and grief all those years, who finally had the opportunity to confront the man responsible and tell him what his crimes had cost them. They spoke of loss that could never be calculated or repaired. They described daughters who would never marry or have children. They talked about grandchildren who would never exist. They wept and raged and demanded that Ridgway acknowledge what he had taken from them. And Gary Ridgway sat impassively, occasionally nodding, his face showing nothing, his presence in the courtroom somehow making the proceedings feel hollow despite the emotion that filled the room. Judge Richard Jones pronounced sentence with the gravity appropriate to unprecedented circumstances. 48 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Ridgway would never be released. He would never experience freedom again. The remainder of his natural life would be spent in confinement, locked away from society, his name recorded in criminal history as one of the most prolific serial killers ever captured. Jones spoke about the suffering Ridgway had inflicted, the families he had destroyed, the breach of trust that came from murders committed against the most vulnerable members of society. And then the proceeding ended. The courtroom emptied, and Gary Ridgway was transported to prison to begin serving a sentence that would only end with his death. The investigation that had consumed 2 decades finally closed. The task force dissolved, the evidence was archived, the families began the difficult work of moving forward, carrying memories of daughters who would remain forever young, forever missed, forever absent from the lives they should have lived. And in prison, Gary Ridgway adapted to his new circumstances with the same bland acceptance he had shown throughout the confession process. He was assigned to segregated housing for his own protection. He received meals through a slot in his door. He spent 23 hours daily in his cell. He had no visitors beyond occasional attorneys handling technical legal matters, and he existed in this reduced state, breathing and eating and sleeping but no longer truly participating in life. A historical curiosity locked away, his crimes catalogued, his name a byword for evil, his remaining years stretching ahead of him empty and unchanging until death finally claimed him and removed his presence from a world he had damaged in ways that could never be fully repaired. The forests south of Seattle held their secrets still, a few bodies never found, victims whose names remained unknown, women who had disappeared into the woods and never emerged. But the active killing had ended. The Green River no longer gave up the dead, and the city that had lived through 2 decades of fear and investigation could finally breathe, could finally close the chapter on its darkest period, could remember the victims without the ongoing dread that somewhere the killer still hunted, still selected, still killed. The rain continued falling as it always had, washing the streets, drumming on rooftops, filling the river that had given a killer his name. And Gary Ridgway sat in his cell, the rain beyond his hearing, his life reduced to concrete and steel, an endless time, punishment that would continue until his final breath released him into whatever darkness waited beyond.